Hey guys, what's up? The night is deep now. I hope you found a way to settle in, perhaps adjusting the weight of your blanket or finding that specific cool spot on the pillow. Tonight, we are drifting back 2,000 years to the marble-clad halls of ancient Rome, a place of absolute power and absolute fragility. We are going to explore the life of Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, a man the world remembers as Caligula. This is not just a chronicle of a mad king. It is a slow-motion study of what happens when the human mind is stripped of its boundaries and handed the keys to an empire. This is a very long journey, an exhaustive dive into the surreal and the snarky reality of a man who thought himself a god. I encourage you to stay with me until the very end of this series. The true weight of the tragedy only reveals itself in the final quiet echoes of the fall. If you find this atmosphere helping you relax, or if you simply appreciate the dry retelling of human absurdity, please subscribe to the channel. It ensures that these stories and your rest can continue uninterrupted. Now, let the world outside fade away. Let the noise of the modern day dissolve into the steady, rhythmic pulse of history. The Roman Empire in the early 1st century was like a massive, ornate ship where the crew had realized, with varying degrees of horror, that the captain wasn't actually looking at the charts. It was a time of immense wealth and even more immense paranoia. At the center of this was the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a family tree so tangled it looked more like a briar patch and just as likely to draw blood if you leaned too close. In the year 12 AD, a boy named Gaius was born. His father was Germanicus, the golden boy of the Roman legions. Germanicus was the kind of man who was so popular it was actually dangerous for his health. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was a woman of such terrifying resolve that she likely could have stared down a charging elephant without blinking. As a toddler, Gaius was the mascot of the Rhine legions. His parents dressed him in a miniature soldier's outfit, complete with tiny, handcrafted military boots called coligi. The hardened, scarred legionaries thought this was adorable. They called him Caligula, which translates to Little Boots. It was a nickname born of affection, but as Gaius grew older, it became a label he loathed. It is one of history's better ironies that one of its most feared tyrants is known to us by a name that sounds like a character from a children's book. The gods, meanwhile, were playing their usual game of indifferent observation. In the Roman mind, the gods weren't beacons of morality. They were more like temperamental aristocrats who lived in a penthouse upstairs and occasionally threw lightning bolts when the music got too loud. Mars, the god of war, was likely watching the young Gaius in the military camps, perhaps amused by the child in the tiny boots, unaware that this boy would one day declare war on a literal ocean. The stability of Gaius's world shattered in 19 AD when his father, Germanicus, died in Antioch. The circumstances were suspicious. Vague mentions of poison and dark magic were whispered in the streets. Rome went into a state of grief that bordered on the theatrical. While the public wept, the Emperor Tiberius, Gaius's great-uncle, sat in his palace and likely sighed of relief that his most popular rival was gone. Tiberius was a man who had mastered the art of being miserable. He eventually grew so tired of the sun and the people of Rome that he retreated to the island of Capri. From there, he ruled through a series of increasingly frantic and blood-soaked letters. Back in Rome, Agrippina, Gaius's mother, began a long, losing battle of wills with Tiberius. One by one, Gaius's family members began to vanish, exiled to barren islands or encouraged to starve themselves to death in dark cells. By some stroke of luck, or perhaps because he was so young he wasn't perceived as a threat, Gaius survived. In 31 AD, Tiberius summoned the 19-year-old Gaius to join him on Capri. Imagine that environment, a sun-drenched island of imaginable luxury, inhabited by a paranoid, aging emperor and a court of sycophants who knew that a single wrong word meant a long drop off a limestone cliff. Gaius spent 6 years there. He learned to wear a mask. He watched as Tiberius indulged in cruelties that the historians of the time were almost too embarrassed to write down. He learned that power wasn't about governing, it was about the ability to make the world bend to your specific, personal darkness. Tiberius reportedly said, "I am nursing a viper for the Roman people." It was perhaps the only honest thing he said during his entire reign. He saw the hollow space behind Gaius's eyes, a space where empathy should have been, but which had been replaced by a dry, snarky detachment from the value of human life. In 37 AD, Tiberius finally died. Some say it was old age, others say the pillow over his face was held by the hand of the Praetorian prefect, Macro, while Gaius looked on with a bored expression. The news was met with a celebration so intense as if the sun had come out after a century of rain. The people loved Gaius because they loved his father. They saw him as a savior. For the first few months, he played the part. He burned the treason records, he brought back the exiles, and he spent money like it was going out of style, which under his management it eventually did. But the transition from a prisoner on a cliff to the master of the world is a violent one for the psyche. Then came the illness.
In late 37 AD, Gaius fell into a deep, agonizing fever. The empire stopped. People slept around the palace, offering their lives to the gods if only the young Caesar would recover. When he finally emerged from his chambers, he was physically healed, but the mask had slipped. He realized that if he was the state, and the state was divine, then he was a god, and gods don't have to be reasonable. He looked at the man who had promised his life to the gods for Gaius's recovery, and told him, quite simply, to pay up. He forced the man to follow through on his vow and die. It was a small, petty cruelty, a signal that the era of little boots was over and the era of the divine monster had begun. The Roman night grew colder. In the palace, Gaius began to wander the halls at all hours, unable to sleep. He would talk to the statues. He would invite the moon to visit him. He was no longer a man, he was a force of nature, or so he believed. The Senate, those men in their bleached white togas, began to realize that they hadn't invited a hero back to Rome, they had invited a storm. As we move deeper into this story, we will see the marble start to crack. We will see the treasury empty and the absurdity rise like a tide. But for now, the empire is still quiet. The legions are still at the borders. The gods are still watching. And Gaius is just beginning to realize exactly how much fun he can have with a world that refuses to say no. Elsewhere, in a drafty palace, a plan was likely already forming in the mind of someone who realized that a god is much easier to deal with when he is made of stone rather than flesh. The year 38 AD arrived with a certain heavy stillness. If the previous year had been a honeymoon, this was the morning after, where the headache begins to set in and you realize the person you married is talking to the furniture. Gaius, or Caligula if we must, had survived his fever, but his grip on the mundane world was slipping. He began to find the traditional rituals of Roman power to be dreadfully dull. The Senate, with its endless debates about grain prices and aqueduct maintenance, felt like a room full of elderly men arguing over the color of dust. Gaius wanted something more. He wanted the spectacular. He wanted the impossible. This is where the intersection of the divine and the absurd truly begins. To the Romans, the gods were a constant, looming presence. They were in the trees, the rivers, and the cracks in the pavement, but they generally stayed in their lane. Gaius decided that the lane was wide enough for two. He began to dress as various deities. One day he might be seen in the silk robes and laurel of Apollo. The next, he would be sporting the beard and trident of Neptune. He even occasionally dressed as Venus, which must have been a confusing sight for the Praetorian Guard, who were trained to die for their emperor, but perhaps not to hold his train. The snarky reality of Caligula was that he treated divinity as a fashion statement. He didn't just want to be worshipped, he wanted to win the argument. He once ordered a bridge to be built across the Bay of Baiae, from the pier at Puteoli to the resort of Baiae. It wasn't a bridge of stone or wood, it was a bridge of ships, thousands of them moored in a double line, covered in planks and earth to resemble the Appian Way. Why? Because a fortune teller had once told Tiberius that Gaius had as much chance of becoming emperor as he did of riding a horse across the Bay of Baiae. Gaius spent a fortune, diverted the grain supply of Rome, and essentially created a localized famine just to prove a dead man wrong. He rode across his bridge on a horse, wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great, which he presumably looted from Alexander's tomb in Egypt, because when you're a god emperor, borrowing is a relative term. He didn't just cross it once, he rode back and forth for 2 days, hosting a banquet on the bridge that ended with him ordering his guards to toss some of the guests into the sea. When the guests tried to climb back into the boats, he had them pushed away with oars. It was a joke, you see. The punchline was just a bit wet and fatal. While the emperor was playing at being a bridge builder, the empire was starting to feel the pinch. The massive surplus Tiberius had hoarded, billions of sestertians, was vanishing into these spectacles. But Gaius wasn't worried. If you run out of money, you simply invent new taxes. He taxed everything: lawsuits, weddings, even the services of the city's prostitutes. He reportedly set up a brothel in the palace itself, staffed by the wives of senators, just to ensure he got a cut of the profits and to humiliate the aristocracy simultaneously. It was efficient in a deeply uncomfortable way. The mystery of his madness often overlooks his sense of humor. It was a dry, cruel, and profoundly bored humor. He once stood next to a statue of Jupiter and whispered in its ear, then pretended to listen to a response. When asked what the god had said, Gaius claimed Jupiter was complaining that the palace was too noisy and Gaius should move him out. He was testing the boundaries of what people would accept. He found that if you have enough power, people will accept anything. They will watch you appoint your horse Incitatus as a priest. They will watch you claim you've defeated the god of the sea by collecting seashells on a beach in Gaul. Ah, the British campaign, one of the most beautifully absurd moments in military history. In 40 AD, Gaius marched his legions to the northern coast of Gaul, presumably to invade Britain. The soldiers were geared up, the siege engines were prepped, and the gods were surely leaning in to see the slaughter. Instead, Gaius ordered the men to line up on the shore and attack the waves. He told them to gather shells, the spoils of the ocean, and pack them into crates to be sent back to Rome. Some historians think the soldiers mutinied, and this was his way of humiliating them. Others think he was genuinely declaring war on Neptune. But looking at the dry, snarky trajectory of his life, it's more likely he just found it hilarious to watch the most disciplined fighting force in the world pick up clamshells on his command. It was the ultimate flex.
Back in Rome, the atmosphere was becoming toxic. The palace was no longer a seat of government, it was a theater of the macabre. Gaius had a habit of inviting senators to dinner, only to spend the entire evening laughing hysterically to himself. When asked what was so funny, he would reply, "I was just thinking that with a single nod of my head, I could have all of you executed." It's the kind of dinner table talk that really kills the appetite. His relationship with his sisters was another source of dark fascination. Drusilla, his favorite, died in 38 AD. Gaius went into a grief so profound it bordered on the divine. He declared her a goddess, the first Roman woman to be so honored. He forbade anyone to laugh, bathe, or eat with their family during the period of mourning. He became a man obsessed with the barrier between life and death, perhaps because he felt he belonged to neither. The great war he was fighting wasn't against the Germans or the Britons, it was against the Roman establishment itself. He hated the pretension of the Senate. He hated the gravity of the Roman tradition. He wanted to turn the world into a mirror that reflected only his own whims. But mirrors are fragile. As the treasury hit zero and the list of executed nobles grew longer, the viper Tiberius had raised was starting to run out of people to bite. The Praetorian Guard, the very men who had helped him to the throne, were beginning to look at each other with raised eyebrows. Even a god is only as powerful as the men standing behind him with swords. The gods of Rome remained silent. Mars didn't intervene, Jupiter didn't strike him down. They simply watched as the marble halls of the Palatine Hill became a labyrinth of fear. Gaius was increasingly isolated, surrounded by statues of himself, with the heads of other gods chopped off and replaced with his own likeness. He was everywhere and nowhere, a ghost in a golden crown. Elsewhere, in the quiet shadows of the guard rooms and the private studies of disillusioned generals, the absurdity was reaching its boiling point. The joke was no longer funny. The little boots were trampling too much blood into the carpets.
The year 41 AD arrived with a silence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. By now, the Roman state had become a fever dream. If you were a Roman citizen, you woke up every morning wondering if the sun was rising because the laws of physics dictated it, or because Gaius had simply allowed it. Gaius was now 30 years old, though he possessed the weary cynicism of a man who had lived 1,000 lives and found them all wanting. He had spent the previous years treating the Roman treasury like a personal piggy bank and the Roman elite like a collection of particularly dull insects. The snark had turned into a permanent sneer. He had reached a point of boredom that only the truly powerful can achieve. A boredom so profound it requires blood to alleviate. He had moved beyond merely dressing as the gods. He began to complete them. He ordered that the most sacred statues of the Greek deities, including the Zeus at Olympia, one of the 7 wonders of the world, be brought to Rome so their heads could be removed and replaced with his own likeness. There is a story that when the engineers went to move the statue of Zeus, the god let out a laugh so loud the scaffolding collapsed and the workmen fled. Gaius, undeterred, likely just found the anecdote poorly timed. He didn't need the gods to approve of him. He had already decided they were his peers. The financial reality of the empire at this point was essentially a house of cards in a hurricane. To fund his lifestyle, which included things like drinking pearls dissolved in vinegar and feeding his horse gilded oats, he turned the law into a weapon of mass confiscation. If you were wealthy and your name appeared on a list, you were suddenly very likely to have conspired against the emperor. The punishment was death, and the beneficiary was the imperial purse. It was a very efficient, if somewhat terminal, tax bracket. In the Palatine Palace, the architecture itself began to warp to fit his ego. He extended the palace so that it incorporated the temple of Castor and Pollux, turning the ancient shrine into a mere vestibule. He would often stand between the statues of the twin gods, effectively positioning himself as a third member of the divine family, waiting for passers-by to worship him. One can imagine the awkwardness of a Roman merchant just trying to get through his day, only to find the emperor standing in a doorway, waiting for a compliment. But the most dangerous thing Gaius did wasn't the spending or the blasphemy. It was the way he treated the men who held the swords. Cassius Chaera was a tribune in the Praetorian Guard. He was a veteran, a man of grit and iron who had served under Germanicus. He was also the target of Gaius's most persistent bullying. Gaius, in his infinite desire to be the funniest man in the room, found it hilarious to mock Chaera's supposedly feminine voice. Every day when Chaera asked for the watchword, Gaius would give him something insulting or suggestive, accompanied by a gesture that was meant to humiliate him before his peers. It's the kind of dinner table talk that really kills the appetite. While the empire was slowly crumbling into a state of nervous exhaustion, a conspiracy began to solidify, not in the Senate, where men mostly just whispered into their wine, but in the barracks. It was a collection of officers, senators, and freedmen who had all reached the same conclusion. Rome could survive a tyrant, and it could survive a spendthrift, but it could not survive a comedian with a death wish. The great wars of the past, the Punic Wars, the conquests of Gaul, felt like myths from a different planet. The current war was a psychological one, fought in the hallways of the palace. Gaius became increasingly paranoid, which, to be fair, was the most rational thing about him at the time. He began to trust no one except his Germanic bodyguard, men who didn't speak Latin and didn't care about Roman politics as long as they were paid in gold and meat. The gods, if they were still watching, must have seen the irony. Gaius had spent his reign trying to prove he was immortal, yet he was surrounding himself with more and more protection to prove he was very much aware of his own mortality. He was a god who checked his wine for poison and jumped at the sound of a closing door. In January of 41 AD, the Palatine Games were being held. It was a time of theater, crowds, and heat. Gaius was in his element, presiding over the festivities, feeling the roar of the masses. He felt invincible. He had even planned a trip to Egypt, perhaps to see if the pyramids would make a suitable backdrop for his next costume change. On the final day of the games, Gaius decided to take a shortcut through a narrow, covered gallery under the palace to go to his bath. He was accompanied by a few attendants, and his Germanic guards were trailing some distance behind. In that dim, cool corridor, the air heavy with the scent of damp stone and expensive oils, he met Cassius Chaerea. Chaerea asked for the watchword one last time. Gaius, true to form, gave him a final insult. The absurdity ended there. Chaerea didn't laugh, he struck. The first blow didn't kill him, it merely shocked him. Gaius, the man who talked to the moon and challenged Jupiter, cried out that he was still alive. The conspirators, perhaps fearing that he actually was a god, fell upon him with a ferocity that was more about exorcism than execution. By the time they were done, the little boots that had once been a symbol of a legion's love were soaked in the reality of a mortal's blood. The empire didn't collapse instantly. In fact, for a few hours there was a strange, terrifying vacuum. The Germanic bodyguards, upon finding the body, went on a localized rampage, killing anyone they found in the vicinity. The Senate met in a panic, some actually suggesting that Rome return to being a republic, as if they could simply erase the last 100 years of history with a vote. But the madness of Caligula had a final, snarky postscript. While the senators were debating, the Praetorian Guard was looting the palace. Behind a curtain in a dark corner, they found a man named Claudius, Gaius's uncle, the man everyone thought was a fool, the man who had survived by pretending to be even more harmless than Gaius. They dragged him out, not to kill him, but to crown him. The cycle of the Julio-Claudians wasn't over, it was just moving on to a different kind of dysfunction. As the body of Gaius was hastily buried in a shallow grave, the gods, if they existed, likely turned their attention elsewhere. The experiment was over. The man who would be Jupiter was gone, and all that remained was a massive debt, a lot of headless statues, and a horse that was probably wondering where its next serving of gilded oats was coming from. Elsewhere, in the quiet, dusty archives of the city, the scribes began the long, tedious task of trying to make sense of the last 4 years. They would write about the madness, the monsters, and the shells on the beach. But the truth was simpler. Rome had looked into the mirror of absolute power, and for a brief, surreal moment, the mirror had looked back and laughed. The death of Gaius did not bring the immediate, refreshing clarity the Senate had hoped for. Instead, it brought a heavy, awkward confusion. It was as if a fever had broken, but the patient was left with the realization that they had sold all their furniture while they were delirious. The immediate aftermath of the assassination in the tunnels of the Palatine was less of a political transition and more of a chaotic scramble in a dark room. The conspirators, led by the insulted Chorea, had succeeded in their primary goal, ending the joke, but they had no punchline prepared. They fled into the city, leaving Gaius's body on the cold floor, a fallen god whose divinity was rapidly cooling into mundane clay. The empire didn't collapse instantly. In fact, for a few hours there was a strange, terrifying vacuum. The Germanic bodyguards, upon finding the body, went on a localized rampage, killing anyone they found in the vicinity. The Senate met in a panic, some actually suggesting that Rome return to being a republic, as if they could simply erase the last 100 years of history with a vote. But the madness of Caligula had a final, snarky postscript. While the senators were debating, the Praetorian Guard was looting the palace. Behind a curtain in a dark corner, they found a man named Claudius, Gaius's uncle, the man everyone thought was a fool, the man who had survived by pretending to be even more harmless than Gaius. They dragged him out, not to kill him, but to crown him. The cycle of the Julio-Claudians wasn't over, it was just moving on to a different kind of dysfunction. While Claudius was being carried on a litter to the Praetorian camp, looking, by all accounts, like a man being led to his execution, the Senate was still talking. They wanted to restore liberty. But liberty in the 1st century didn't have a private army. The Praetorians did. By the time the sun rose the next day, the Senate realized that their republic was a dream, and Claudius was the reality. They confirmed him as emperor, and the cycle began anew. Gaius's legacy, however, was not so easily swept under the rug. He had left the empire's finances in a state that would make a modern bankruptcy lawyer weep. He had insulted every major institution. He had turned the concept of the princeps, the first citizen, into a parody of a Hellenistic god-king. The mystery of his madness remains a favorite topic for those who like to overanalyze the past. Was it a brain fever? Was it the result of growing up in a house where everyone was trying to kill him? Or was it simply the logical conclusion of giving a 24-year-old absolute power over a world that refused to tell him no? If you tell a man he is a god often enough, eventually he's going to start wondering why he's still eating bread like a mortal. The Great War of Gaius ended not with a conquest of Britain or the defeat of the Germans, but with a pile of seashells and a very expensive bridge that led nowhere. It was a war against the very idea of restraint. He proved that the Roman system, for all its marble and majesty, was incredibly fragile. It relied on the person at the top agreeing to play a role. Once Gaius decided to stop playing the role and start playing the player, the whole theater began to collapse. In the years that followed, Claudius did his best to fix the plumbing. He was a scholar, a man of books and history. He likely spent a lot of time looking at the records of his nephew's reign and shaking his head. He finished the aqueducts Gaius had neglected. He actually invaded Britain with soldiers who fought people instead of waves, and he tried to restore some dignity to the office. But the ghost of Gaius lingered. He had set a precedent. He had shown that the emperor could be anything, a god, a monster, a gladiator, a bride. He had broken the fourth wall of Roman politics. The emperors who followed, Nero in particular, would look back at the madness of Gaius not as a warning, but as a blueprint. The gods of Rome, the real ones, or at least the ones the people believed in, seemed to have moved on. The temple of Castor and Pollux was repaired. The entrance to the palace was moved, and the statues with Gaius's head were either toppled or recarved. It's quite easy to change the face of a god when the god is made of stone. You just need a chisel and a bit of time. As we look back at this surreal chapter of the Roman story, it feels less like history and more like a fever dream that the world collectively decided to forget. But the cracks remained. The fall of the empire wouldn't happen for centuries, but the structural integrity of the Roman soul had been compromised. They had seen the little boots stomp across their traditions, and they had realized that their eternal city was only as stable as the mind of the man sitting on the Palatine Hill. The night is very quiet now. The stories of the Julio-Claudians always end in a sort of heavy, exhausted silence. It's the silence of a palace after the torches have burned out, leaving only the smell of smoke and the memory of a laugh that went on just a bit too long. Elsewhere, in the far reaches of the provinces, life went on. The fall of an empire is a slow process, a series of small, quiet collapses that no one notices until the roof finally caves in. And for a few years in the 1st century, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus was the man who decided to see what would happen if he started pulling out the nails. The transition from the reign of Gaius to the reign of Claudius was like waking up from a particularly vivid nightmare, only to realize you are still in the same house, and the house is still on fire, but at least the new owner is looking for a bucket. The madness of Gaius left a vacuum that was filled with a strange, nervous energy. The Roman people, who had initially cheered for the little boots, now found themselves in a state of collective amnesia. They didn't want to remember the banquets on the bridge or the seashells in the crates. They wanted to return to a version of Rome that made sense. But Rome was a city built on the idea of permanence, and Gaius had shown them that everything, the laws, the gods, even the floor beneath their feet, was subject to the whim of a single, unstable mind. As we move into the year 42 AD, the dust began to settle on the Palatine Hill. The blood had been scrubbed from the underground gallery where Gaius met his end, though the servants said the air there always felt a few degrees colder than the rest of the palace. Claudius, the man who had been hailed by a random soldier, was now busy trying to prove that he was more than just a survivor of a family purge. He was a man of the library, not the parade ground. He was a historian who suddenly found himself tasked with writing the next chapter of his own history. And his first task was to deal with the Gaius problem. He couldn't simply erase his nephew. The Roman state didn't work like that, but he could quietly dismantle the cult of personality. He didn't declare Gaius a public enemy, but he did allow his statues to be removed and his memory to fade into a dark, snarky footnote.
The intersection of war and myth during this period took on a more practical, albeit still strange, tone. Claudius knew that to stay in power, he needed a victory, a real one. Not a victory over the waves of the English Channel, but a victory over the people who lived on the other side of it. This led to the actual invasion of Britain in 43 AD. While the Roman legions were crossing the sea, this time with the intention of actually staying, the gods were being invited back into the fold. Claudius was a traditionalist. He revived ancient religious ceremonies that had fallen into disuse. He tried to convince the Roman people that the gods weren't just the emperor's playthings, but the guardians of the state.
He wanted to restore the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods. But even as he built new aqueducts and expanded the harbor at Ostia, the shadow of the mysterious fall of empires began to lengthen. It wasn't a sudden drop, but a gradual erosion. The treasury, which Gaius had treated like a bottomless pit, was slowly being replenished, but the cost was a heavier bureaucracy. The first citizen was becoming a bureaucrat in chief. The snarky reality of this period is that while the empire looked stronger on the outside, it was becoming more brittle on the inside. The court of Claudius was a place of intrigue, dominated by his freedmen, former slaves who were smarter than the senators, and his wives, who were arguably more ambitious than he was. The irony of Caligula's reign was that he was too loud. The irony of Claudius's reign was that the real power was starting to whisper in the corners. The gods, meanwhile, must have been watching the British campaign with a sense of déjà vu. The Roman soldiers, superstitious and weary, still looked at the sea as a hostile deity. They were marching into a land of fog and forests, fighting a people who painted themselves blue and claimed their own gods were much fiercer than the ones from the Mediterranean. It was a clash of mythologies, but the Roman iron usually had the final word. While the empire was expanding its borders, the internal rot was merely shifting shape. The Julio-Claudian bloodline was thinning, becoming a toxic mix of inbreeding and paranoia. The madness of Caligula hadn't been an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a system that put too much pressure on a single point. In the quiet hours of the night, perhaps sitting in his study and writing his lost history of the Etruscans, Claudius must have felt the weight of it. He was a man who understood the past, which meant that every empire, no matter how many aqueducts it builds, is eventually reclaimed by the dust. He knew that the gods eventually stop listening and the soldiers eventually stop following. The tragedy of the Roman story isn't that it ended, but that it took so long to realize it was over. The absurdity of Caligula's reign was a flare sent up in the dark, a signal that the old world was dying and something much more unpredictable was taking its place. Elsewhere, in the drafty forests of Germany and the sun-baked deserts of the East, the enemies of Rome were waiting. They didn't care about the watchwords of the Praetorian Guard or the grievances of Cassius Chaerea. They were just watching the stone roll down the hill, waiting for the moment it finally hit the bottom. We have much more to cover. The story of Rome is a long, winding path through the wreckage of human ambition. As we move forward, we will see how the empire tried to survive its own success, and how the gods, both the ones in the temples and the ones on the throne, eventually left the stage. The year was 44 AD, and the Roman world was attempting to settle into a rhythm of forced normalcy. It was as if the entire city had collectively agreed to treat the reign of Caligula like a particularly embarrassing blackout at a party. Nobody wanted to mention the shells, the bridge, or the horse that had nearly been a consul. But the thing about collective amnesia is that the scars remain even if you refuse to remember how you got them. While Claudius was busy in his study trying to reorganize the Roman world into something that made sense on paper, the absurdity that Gaius had unleashed was simply changing clothes. The intersection of power and divinity had been permanently blurred. In the old days, a Roman emperor was a man who acted like a god. After Caligula, a Roman emperor was a god who occasionally had to act like a man. It was a subtle but exhausting distinction. The British campaign was continuing, and for the first time in years, the Roman people were hearing about real wars again. not wars against the waves, but wars against people like Caratacus, chieftains who didn't care about Roman fashion or the snarky internal politics of the Palatine Hill. To the Roman soldier in the mud of Britain, Jupiter was a long way off, and the god that mattered was the one who kept his shield from cracking in the damp. There is a dry irony in the fact that Claudius, the man who was considered a mistake of nature, was actually providing the empire with its most stable period in decades. He was the anti-Caligula. Where Gaius was impulsive, Claudius was plodding. Where Gaius was theatrical, Claudius was academic. Yet the palace remained a labyrinth of shadows. The mystery of the fall of empires often lies in these quiet middle years. It's not always about a dramatic barbarian invasion or a sudden plague. Sometimes it's about the slow shift of power from the public senate to the private bedroom. Claudius was increasingly dependent on his freedmen, men like Narcissus and Pallas. These were former slaves who now held the purse strings of the world. The Roman elite, the men who could trace their lineage back to the founding of the city, found themselves having to beg for favors from men who had once been property.
The gods must have found this particularly amusing. The social order of Rome was being turned upside down, not by a revolution, but by a quiet, bureaucratic takeover. While the empire was expanding into the misty forests of the north, the internal rot was finding a new home in the person of Messalina, Claudius's third wife. If Caligula's madness was a fever, the court of Messalina was a slow-acting poison. She was a woman who realized that if the emperor was distracted by his books and his harbor projects, she could essentially run the city as her own private playground. The stories told of Messalina mirror the absurdity of Caligula, but with a different flavor. She didn't want to be a god, she just wanted everything she saw. She would dispose of rivals with a casual wave of her hand, much like Gaius had done, but with a cold, calculated efficiency that lacked his erratic flair. The palace was once again a place where you had to be careful how you breathed, but for different reasons. Under Gaius, you feared the explosion. Under Messalina, you feared the whisper. Elsewhere, in the drafty, unfinished corners of the empire, the infrastructure was being built. Claudius was obsessed with aqueducts and grain. He understood that a well-fed city is a quiet city. He was trying to buy the loyalty of the Roman people with water and bread, hoping they would forget the blood that had been spilled in the tunnels beneath their feet. But history is a persistent creditor. The debt of the Julio-Claudian name was still unpaid. The great wars were being fought on the fringes, but the real battle was for the soul of the Principate. Was it a Roman office, or was it a Hellenistic monarchy? Gaius had tried to force it into a monarchy overnight and had been killed for it. Claudius was trying to pretend it was still a Roman office while exercising the power of a king. It was a delicate, awkward dance. The gods of Rome, the old stern ones like Juno and Vesta, seemed to be retreating into the background. The new gods were the emperors themselves. The imperial cult was becoming the glue that held the empire together, a bizarre religion where the god was a man you could see, a man who aged, a man who stuttered, and a man who could be poisoned. It was a theology of the tangible, and it was deeply fragile. As the 40s AD progressed, the madness of Caligula began to look less like an outlier and more like a preview. The structural integrity of the empire was being held together by the sheer momentum of its own weight. The legions were still disciplined,
The taxes were still being collected, and the roads were still being paved. But the heart of the machine, the leadership in Rome, was becoming a theater of the surreal. In the quiet hours of a Roman evening, you might have seen Claudius walking through his new gardens, perhaps stopping to talk to a statue of his brother Germanicus. He was a man who had seen everyone he loved die, and he knew that his own time was a borrowed luxury. He was a historian living in a tragedy, and he knew how these stories ended. The fall of an empire is rarely a straight line. It is a series of loops and zigzags. Gaius had taken Rome on a wild, terrifying detour. Claudius was trying to steer it back to the main road, but the wheels were already wobbly. And waiting in the wings was a young boy named Nero, who was watching his great-uncle and his mother and learning all the wrong lessons about what it meant to be a god. The year 48 AD brought with it a scandal that felt like the final, exhausted gasp of the old Roman dignity. While Claudius was away at Ostia, checking on the grain silos and likely boring a local official with a lecture on the history of Etruscan pottery, his wife Messalina decided to engage in a bit of absurdist theater that would have even made Gaius raise an eyebrow. She didn't just take a lover, she held a formal wedding ceremony with him while still married to the emperor of the known world. This was the snarky reality of the Claudian court. It was a place where everyone knew the emperor was the last to know anything. When the news finally reached Claudius, carried by his terrified freedmen, who realized that if Messalina's new husband took power, their own heads would be the first to roll, the emperor's first reaction wasn't a rage, it was a stuttered question. Am I still the emperor? It is a hauntingly pathetic question for the man who commanded the legions in Britain and the grain ships of Egypt. It revealed the hollowness that Caligula first exposed. The throne was only as solid as the person sitting on it. If you have to ask if you are still the emperor, the answer is already starting to drift away in the wind. Messalina was executed. The gods, as usual, did not intervene. They simply allowed the swords of the Praetorian Guard to do the talking. Claudius, now a widower and deeply shaken, swore he would never marry again. He told the guards that if he ever did, they had his permission to kill him. But the madness of Caligula had left a vacuum in the Roman soul that was increasingly being filled by a new kind of toxicity, the ambition of Agrippina the Younger. She was Gaius's sister, the daughter of Germanicus, and the woman who possessed all of the family's brilliance with none of its restraint. She decided that Claudius needed a wife, and that wife should be her. The fact that she was his niece was a minor detail. The Senate, which had once debated the ethics of republican virtue, now spent its time passing a law to make incest legal for the emperor. This was the intersection of law and myth, where the rules of men were rewritten to satisfy the desires of a family that believed the world was their private estate.
Agrippina didn't just want the title of empress, she wanted the succession. She had a son from a previous marriage, a boy named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, whom we know better as Nero. She groomed him, she polished him, and she systematically removed anyone who stood in his way. She convinced Claudius to adopt him, placing him ahead of Claudius's own son, Britannicus. The atmosphere in Rome during the early 50s AD was like a stagnant pool. On the surface, things were calm. The wars in Britain were being won, the aqueducts were flowing, and the grain was arriving. But beneath the surface, the rot was accelerating.
The mystery of the fall of empires is often found in these moments of quiet compromise. Each time a senator bowed to a freedman, each time a law was changed to suit a royal whim, a stone was removed from the foundation of the state. The gods were being pushed further into the shadows. The Roman people were becoming spectators in their own history. They watched as Agrippina took over the administration, appearing on coins and sitting on a throne next to Claudius at public functions. It was a level of female power that Rome had never seen and wasn't built to handle. As the year 54 AD approached, Claudius was becoming a liability to his own wife. He was starting to show signs of regret. He was spending more time with his biological son, Britannicus. He was heard muttering that it was his fate to have to endure the vices of his wives and then punish them. Agrippina, hearing this, realized that the clock was ticking. If Claudius lived long enough for Britannicus to reach adulthood, her son Nero might never wear the purple. And so we come to the famous dish of mushrooms. There is a dark, snarky symmetry to the death of Claudius. The man who spent his life trying to bring order to the chaos left behind by Caligula was reportedly brought down by a fungus. Some say the poison was on the mushrooms. Others say it was on a feather used to induce vomiting when the mushrooms didn't work fast enough. Regardless of the method, the result was the same. The scholar emperor, the man who had survived the viper's nursery of Capri and the madness of his nephew, died in the middle of the night while the city slept. Nero was hailed as emperor. He was 17 years old. He was the great-nephew of the man who hid behind a curtain, the nephew of the man who declared war on the sea, and the son of the woman who had poisoned his predecessor. The great wars were far away. The mysterious fall of the empire was still centuries in the future. But as the sun rose on the first day of Nero's reign, the Roman world felt a familiar, cold shiver. The joke wasn't over. It had just been passed to a younger, more talented performer. Elsewhere, in the drafty, abandoned temples of the old gods, the wind whistled through the marble. The people of Rome woke up and prepared for the games, unaware that they were about to witness a performance that would make the reign of Caligula look like a dress rehearsal. The story of the madness was no longer about a single man. It had become the story of an institution. The throne of the Caesars was a seat of fire, and the next person to sit on it was already reaching for the torch.
The mystery of Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, was the next thread to be snipped. As the boy approached the age where he could claim his manhood and perhaps the throne, he suddenly died at a banquet. The official story was an epileptic fit. The snarky historical reality was that he turned blue and stopped breathing the moment he drank his wine. Nero, watching his stepbrother die in front of the entire court, calmly told the guests not to worry, as Britannicus had always been prone to fits. It was a lie so bold it was almost divine. With Britannicus gone, the air in the palace grew even thinner. Agrippina realized she was losing her grip. She tried to threaten Nero, reminding him that she was the one who had made him. Nero responded by stripping her of her honors and moving her out of the palace. The viper's nursery was once again active, and the mother of the emperor was finding out that her son was a very quick study in the art of the family trade. Elsewhere, in the drafty forests of Armenia and the damp hills of Britain, the legions were still fighting. They were the last remnant of the old Rome, the Rome of iron and discipline. But even they were becoming a myth, a distant rumor in a city that was now obsessed with Nero's hair, his chariots, and his increasingly high-pitched singing. The fire that would eventually consume Rome was still years away, but the sparks were being struck in the hearts of the men who watched their emperor trade his dignity for a lyre. The collapse wasn't a roar. It was a slow, rhythmic hum of a string being pulled too tight. By the year 58 AD, the atmosphere in Rome had transitioned from the youthful exuberance of a new reign into a heavy, stagnant anxiety. Nero had discovered that being emperor was less about the burden of the state and more about the removal of obstacles. And the largest, most formidable obstacle remained his mother, Agrippina. The relationship between Nero and Agrippina was a toxic brew of Greco-Roman myth and cold, calculated dysfunction. She was the woman who had survived the purges of Tiberius, the whims of Caligula, and the mushrooms of Claudius. She was, in many ways, the final boss of the Julio-Claudian era. Nero, meanwhile, had found a new muse in Poppaea Sabina, a woman of such staggering ambition and beauty that she reportedly bathed in the milk of 500 asses to keep her skin pale. Poppaea didn't want a mother-in-law looking over her shoulder, and Nero was tired of being scolded like a schoolboy by the woman who had given him the world. What followed was one of the most absurdly over-engineered assassination plots in human history. Nero didn't want to simply execute his mother, that would be poor optics. He wanted a mysterious accident. He consulted his engineers, who built him a self-collapsing ceiling designed to crush her in her bed. When that failed to trigger, they moved on to a more nautical approach, a trick boat. The boat was designed to fall apart at sea, a masterpiece of mechanical treachery. Nero invited his mother to a feast at Baiae, a coastal resort known for its luxury and lack of morals. He hugged her, kissed her, and sent her off on the death galley under the light of a serene, indifferent moon. The gods of the sea, Neptune and his court, were seemingly given a front-row seat to the spectacle. The boat collapsed as planned, but Agrippina, being a woman forged in the fires of Roman survival, simply swam to shore. She sent a message to Nero, telling him she had survived the unfortunate accident. Nero's reaction was not of relief, but of sheer, unadulterated panic. He realized that the accident didn't work. The next step had to be the sword. He sent the sailors and a few soldiers to finish the job. According to the chronicles, when they arrived at her villa, she bared her womb and told them to strike here, the place that had birthed such a monster. The snarky reality of the aftermath was that Nero spent the rest of his life haunted by her ghost. He claimed she followed him with torches and whips. He tried to appease the gods, but even the Roman deities had their limits. The murder of a parent, matricide, was the ultimate Roman taboo, a crack in the moral universe that no amount of marble could bridge. While the palace was drowning in this domestic bloodbath, the empire was facing a different kind of reality in the east. The Great War with Parthia over Armenia was heating up. General Corbulo, a man of the old school who probably viewed Nero's singing with the same enthusiasm one views a plague of locusts, was doing the actual work of empire building. He was marching through deserts and besieging fortresses, maintaining the myth of Roman invincibility, while his emperor was busy choreographing his next stage entrance. The mystery of the fall of empires is often found in this disconnect between the periphery and the center. On the borders, Rome was still a lion. In the capital, it was becoming a peacock. The treasury was beginning to groan under the weight of Nero's golden house, the Domus Aureus, a palace so vast it reportedly had a rotating dining room and fields of grain inside the city walls. The gods were increasingly treated as extras in Nero's personal movie. He began to identify himself with Apollo, the god of music and light. He held the Neuronia, a festival of music, wrestling, and poetry, where he was, shockingly, always the winner. To lose to the emperor was to lose your life, so the competition was, let's say, less than spirited. As the 60s AD dawned, the absurdity was no longer a sideshow, it was the main event. The Roman elite were forced to sit through hours of Nero's singing, forbidden to leave the theater. Some men reportedly feigned death to be carried out on stretchers, while others jumped from the walls to escape the boredom of the imperial lyre. It was a tragedy of the mundane, a slow-motion collapse of dignity that preceded the collapse of the state.
Elsewhere, in a cold, damp province called Britain, a queen named Boudica was beginning to realize that the Romans weren't gods. They were just men who had forgotten how to fight. The fire was coming, but it wouldn't start in Rome. It would start at the edge of the world. The year 60 AD brought a chilling realization to the Roman administration. The world did not actually end at the edges of the Mediterranean, and the people living in the damp, gray fringes of the empire were not particularly impressed by Nero's vocal range. While the emperor was busy contemplating the acoustics of his next private recital, a different kind of music was rising in the province of Britannia, the rhythmic clashing of iron against bronze. The absurdity of Roman provincial management had reached its peak. When Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe, died, he left half his kingdom to the emperor, hoping this bribe would protect his daughters and his people. He had forgotten that the Roman state, under Nero's distant gaze, was no longer a protector, it was a parasite. The local Roman procurators, men with the moral compass of a broken sundial, ignored the will, flogged Prasutagus's widow Boudica, and violated his daughters. The gods of the Celts, dark, earthy deities who lived in groves and demanded blood, must have watched with grim satisfaction as Boudica raised an army. The Roman gods, meanwhile, were represented in Britain by a massive, expensive temple to the deified Claudius in the city of Camulodunum. To the Britons, this temple wasn't a place of worship, it was a citadel of eternal slavery. The war that followed was not the sanitized, strategic affair found in Caesar's commentaries. It was a raw, chaotic eruption. Boudica's forces didn't just defeat the Romans, they attempted to erase them. They burned Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium to the ground. The archaeology of these cities still shows a distinct destruction layer, a thick, red-black streak of ash that marks the moment the British myth collided with Roman reality. In Rome, the news of the revolt was treated with a sort of dry, detached annoyance. Nero's first instinct, reportedly, was to withdraw from Britain entirely. He found the province cold, expensive, and lacking in decent theater. It was the snarky peak of his reign. The son of Germanicus, the heir of Caesar,
considered abandoning a conquest because the logistics were getting in the way of his hobbies. But the mysterious resilience of the Roman military machine, still operating on the momentum of previous generations, saved the day. General Suetonius Paulinus, a man who had more in common with the grit of the Republic than the glitter of the Palatine, forced a confrontation at the Battle of Watling Street. Despite being outnumbered almost 20-1, the Roman legions stood in their disciplined wedges. They didn't sing, they threw javelins. The slaughter was absolute. The British rebellion ended not with a treaty, but with a massacre of the baggage train. Boudica poisoned herself, vanishing into the mists of history and becoming a myth that would haunt the Roman psyche for centuries. While the provincial soil was soaked in blood, Nero was finding new ways to spend the money that Suetonius Paulinus was busy defending. He was becoming obsessed with grand design. He looked at the cramped, winding streets of Rome, a city that had grown organically and messy, and he saw a canvas that needed clearing. The great fire of Rome was still 4 years away, but in the mind of Nero, the city was already a set that needed to be struck so a better one could be built. The mystery of the fall of empires is often found in this shift from us to me. The emperor no longer saw himself as the head of the Roman people, but as an artist who happened to have a cast of millions. The intersection of war and myth had become entirely internal. Nero's Great War was now against the traditionalists in the Senate who thought an emperor should be more than a chariot driver with an ego. As the 60s AD progressed, the viper that Tiberius had nursed was long dead, but the artiste that Agrippina had birthed was becoming far more dangerous. He was beginning to realize that if he could survive the murder of his mother and the near loss of a province, he could survive anything. The boundaries were gone, the gods were silent, and the city of Rome, old and wooden and dry, was waiting for a spark. Elsewhere, in the quiet, drafty villa of a retired general or the back room of a disgruntled merchant, people were starting to talk about the fall. They didn't mean the end of the world, they meant the end of sanity. They were looking for a sign. The year 64 AD brought a chilling realization to the Roman administration. The world did not actually end at the edges of the Mediterranean, and the people living in the damp, gray fringes of the empire were not particularly impressed by Nero's vocal range. While the emperor was busy contemplating the acoustics of his next private recital, a different kind of music was rising in the province of Britannia, the rhythmic clashing of iron against bronze. The absurdity of Roman provincial management had reached its peak. When Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe, died, he left half his kingdom to the emperor, hoping this bribe would protect his daughters and his people. He had forgotten that the Roman state, under Nero's distant gaze, was no longer a protector, it was a parasite. The local Roman procurators, men with the moral compass of a broken sundial, ignored the will, flogged Prasutagus's widow Boudica, and violated his daughters. The gods of the Celts, dark, earthy deities who lived in groves and demanded blood, must have watched with grim satisfaction as Boudica raised an army. The Roman gods, meanwhile, were represented in Britain by a massive, expensive temple to the deified Claudius in the city of Camulodunum. To the Britons, this temple wasn't a place of worship, it was a citadel of eternal slavery. The war that followed was not the sanitized, strategic affair found in Caesar's commentaries. It was a raw, chaotic eruption. Boudicca's forces didn't just defeat the Romans, they attempted to erase them. They burned Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium to the ground. The archaeology of these cities still shows a distinct destruction layer, a thick, red-black streak of ash that marks the moment the British myth collided with Roman reality. In Rome, the news of the revolt was treated with a sort of dry, detached annoyance. Nero's first instinct, reportedly, was to withdraw from Britain entirely. He found the province cold, expensive, and lacking in decent theater. It was the snarky peak of his reign. The son of Germanicus, the heir of Caesar, considered abandoning a conquest because the logistics were getting in the way of his hobbies. But the mysterious resilience of the Roman military machine, still operating on the momentum of previous generations, saved the day. General Suetonius Paulinus, a man who had more in common with the grit of the Republic than the glitter of the Palatine, forced a confrontation at the Battle of Watling Street. Despite being outnumbered almost 20-1, the Roman legions stood in their disciplined wedges. They didn't sing, they threw javelins. The slaughter was absolute. The British rebellion ended not with a treaty, but with a massacre of the baggage train.
Boudica poisoned herself, vanishing into the mists of history and becoming a myth that would haunt the Roman psyche for centuries. While the provincial soil was soaked in blood, Nero was finding new ways to spend the money that Suetonius Paulinus was busy defending. He was becoming obsessed with grand design. He looked at the cramped, winding streets of Rome, a city that had grown organically and messy, and he saw a canvas that needed clearing. The Great Fire of Rome was still 4 years away, but in the mind of Nero, the city was already a set that needed to be struck so a better one could be built. The mystery of the fall of empires is often found in this shift from us to me. The emperor no longer saw himself as the head of the Roman people, but as an artist who happened to have a cast of millions. The intersection of war and myth had become entirely internal. Nero's Great War was now against the traditionalists in the Senate, who thought an emperor should be more than a chariot driver with an ego. As the 60s AD progressed, the viper that Tiberius had nursed was long dead, but the artiste that Agrippina had birthed was becoming far more dangerous. He was beginning to realize that if he could survive the murder of his mother and the near loss of a province, he could survive anything. The boundaries were gone, the gods were silent, and the city of Rome, old and wooden and dry, was waiting for a spark. Elsewhere, in the quiet, drafty villa of a retired general or the back room of a disgruntled merchant, people were starting to talk about the fall. They didn't mean the end of the world, they meant the end of the sanity. They were looking for a sign. The year 64 AD brought with it a heat wave that seemed to turn the Tiber into a sluggish, tepid ribbon of bronze. Rome was a tinderbox, and the absurdity of its leadership had reached a point where the people were almost waiting for a catastrophe to break the tension. They got their wish in the form of a fire that began near the Circus Maximus, a small, ambitious flame that decided to take a tour of the world's most powerful city. For 6 days and 7 nights, the fire danced through the narrow, crooked streets. It leaped over the stone structures of the wealthy and devoured the wooden tenements of the poor with a rhythmic, crackling hunger. The gods of Rome, usually so vocal in their demands for sacrifice, were remarkably quiet as their temples melted. The Temple of Vesta, the very heart of the Roman soul, was reduced to a pile of glowing charcoal. The snarky reality of the Great Fire is, of course, the image of Nero on his balcony. History tells us he fiddled, but since the fiddle hadn't been invented yet, he likely played his lyre and sang the Sack of Ilium. It was the ultimate Neronian moment. A city was dying in agony, and the emperor viewed it as a backdrop for a musical performance. To Nero, the fire wasn't a tragedy, it was a lighting effect. When the smoke finally cleared, 10 of Rome's 14 districts were in ruins. Thousands were homeless, and a scent of burnt marble and charred flesh hung over the hills like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The mystery of the fall of empires often lies in how a leader handles a crisis, and Nero's handling was a masterpiece of me-first optics. He immediately appropriated the scorched heart of the city, land that had belonged to the people, to build his Domus Aurea, the Golden House. Imagine a palace that spanned 3 of Rome's 7 hills. It featured a rotating dining room that mimicked the movement of the heavens, walls covered in gold leaf and inlaid with mother-of-pearl, and a colossal 120-foot bronze statue of Nero himself standing in the vestibule like a god who had forgotten to leave. The intersection of myth and architecture was complete. Nero wasn't just living in Rome, he was making Rome live inside him. The people, however, were not amused. The rumor that Nero had started the fire himself began to circulate through the ruins like a second, slower plague. Nero, realizing that even a god needs a scapegoat, turned his gaze toward a small, secretive Eastern cult that had been making a nuisance of itself by talking about a different kind of kingdom. They were the Christians. The absurdity of their punishment was a new low for the Roman state. Nero turned their executions into garden parties. He had Christians dressed in animal skins to be torn apart by dogs. He had them nailed to crosses, and most famously, he used them as human torches, lighting his gardens at night with their burning bodies while he drove his chariot among the guests. It was a war against a tiny minority, treated with the same theatrical flair he brought to his stage performances. While the artiste was busy illuminating his gardens with human lives, the empire's borders were starting to fray. In Judea, a different kind of fire was smoldering, a religious and political resentment that would soon explode into a great war. The gods of the East were not as easily incorporated into the Roman pageant as the gods of Greece. The mystery of the one God of the Jews was a puzzle that Roman iron couldn't seem to solve. The treasury was now not just empty, it was in a state of negative existence. To pay for the Golden House, Nero began to devalue the currency, reducing the silver content of the denarius. It was a quiet, bureaucratic step toward the fall,
a way of lying to the world about the value of its own labor. Elsewhere, in the drafty, austere tents of the legions in Germany and the East, the soldiers were looking at their thinner coins and hearing stories of the human torches in Rome. The myth of the emperor as the first soldier was dead. Nero was something else now, a gilded creature that lived in a rotating house, a man who had replaced the Roman virtues of gravitas and pietas with a high-pitched C sharp. The shadows were lengthening over the Neronian era. The great fire had cleared the ground, but what was growing in its place wasn't a new Rome. It was a monument to a single man's vanity. And as any historian or architect will tell you, the taller the monument, the harder it is to keep it from toppling when the wind finally changes. The year 65 AD arrived with absolute, suffocating silence. In Rome, silence was no longer just the absence of noise, it was a survival strategy. The absurdity of Nero's reign had transitioned from flamboyant theater into a cold, clinical paranoia. The golden house was rising, but the emperor felt increasingly small within its vast, gilded rooms. He began to realize that while he could build a rotating ceiling that showered guests with rose petals, he could not build a ceiling that protected him from the thoughts of the men standing beneath it. The great war of this year was not fought on a battlefield, but in the private studies and bathhouses of the Roman elite. It was the Pisonian conspiracy, a plan to replace Nero with Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a man who had the distinct advantage of being charming, wealthy, and, most importantly, not Nero. The conspiracy was a sprawling, messy affair involving senators, poets, and even the leadership of the Praetorian Guard. It was a mysterious gathering of people who had finally decided that the artiste had overstayed his welcome. The snarky tragedy of the plot was its failure. It was undone by a freedman named Milicus, who noticed his master sharpening a ceremonial dagger and decided that betrayal was a more lucrative career path than loyalty. What followed was a purge that felt like a rhythmic, systematic pruning of the Roman intellectual garden. The intersection of myth and reality was never more apparent than in the death of Seneca. The philosopher, who had spent years trying to tutor the viper and writing plays about the inevitability of fate, was ordered to commit suicide. His death was a masterpiece of absurdity. He opened his veins, but being old and thin, the blood wouldn't flow. He took poison, but it didn't work. He finally had to be suffocated in a steam bath. As he died, he reportedly continued to dictate his thoughts to his secretaries. It was the ultimate Roman exit, stoic, long-winded, and profoundly uncomfortable. Lucan, the brilliant young poet who had written Pharsalia, was also forced to open his veins. As he bled out, he recited lines from his own poetry about a dying soldier. In Nero's Rome, even your death was expected to be a performance. The gods, if they were listening, were being treated to a marathon of dying monologues. The mystery of the fall of empires is often found in these purges. When a state kills its best thinkers, it is effectively lobotizing itself. Nero was left with a court of sycophants, men who would clap until their hands bled when he sang, and who would tell him that the smell of burning Christians was the finest perfume in the world. The first citizen was now entirely isolated, a god who lived in a house of gold but was terrified of a man with a sharpened stylus. While the elite were bleeding into their baths, the Great War in the East was taking a dark turn.
In 66 AD, the Great Revolt broke out in Judea. The absurdity of Roman taxation and the desecration of the temple in Jerusalem had finally pushed the province over the edge. The Jews, believing in a God who did not require a bronze statue in a rotating dining room, defied the might of Rome. Nero, hearing of the defeat of a Roman legion by a group of rebels, did not reach for his armor. He reached for a general he thought was too boring to be a threat, Vespasian. Vespasian was a man of the dirt and the mule train, a soldier who had once fallen asleep during one of Nero's singing recitals. Nero sent him to Judea, thinking that a man who couldn't appreciate fine music was the perfect candidate to handle a messy, unrefined war. It was a snarky piece of casting that would eventually change the course of history. As the 60s AD continued to unravel, Nero decided to embark on a tour of Greece. He wanted to win all the Olympic prizes because, in his mind, the only thing better than being a Roman god was being a Greek hero. He entered chariot races, fell out of his chariot, and was still declared the winner. He competed in singing contests where the audience was forbidden to leave until he was finished. People were reportedly born and died in the theaters while he held a high note. Elsewhere, in the drafty, silent provinces of the West, the governor of Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex, was looking at the horizon. He wasn't a philosopher like Seneca or a poet like Lucan. He was a man with a province, an army, and a very clear understanding that the man in Greece was no longer an emperor. The fall was no longer a mystery, it was becoming a logistical certainty. The fire that Nero had used to clear the ground for his golden house was about to be matched by a fire that would clear the ground for a new dynasty. But for now, Nero was in Greece, clutching his laurel wreaths and dreaming of a world that was just one long, standing ovation. The year 67 AD found the Roman Empire in a state of geographical schizophrenia. While the actual machinery of the state was grinding to a halt under the weight of debt and resentment, the emperor was on vacation. Nero's tour of Greece was not merely a trip, it was a mysterious attempt to relocate his reality to a place that appreciated his art more than the stodgy traditionalist streets of Rome. The snarky reality of this tour was a comedy of errors performed on a continental scale. Nero participated in the Olympic Games, despite it being an off year. He simply ordered the schedule to be changed, because when you are a living god, time is more of a suggestion than a rule. He competed in the 10-horse chariot race, a feat of absurdity that saw him thrown from his vehicle and nearly trampled into the dust. He never finished the race, yet the judges, with a very clear understanding of their own mortality, awarded him the olive wreath anyway. Nero accepted it with the humility of a man who truly believed he had outrun fate. While Nero was busy winning 1,808 prizes for singing and acting, the Great War in Judea was becoming a systematic slaughter. Vespasian and his son, Titus, were moving through the Galilee like a slow iron tide. They weren't interested in olive wreaths, they were interested in siege engines and the cold math of attrition. The intersection of war and myth was vivid here. The Jewish rebels were fighting for a divine promise, while the Roman legions were fighting for a paycheck and the terrifyingly efficient ghost of the Republic. Back in Greece, Nero decided to undertake a project that had defeated both Periander and Julius Caesar, cutting a canal through the Isthmus of Corinth.
He inaugurated the work by singing a hymn and digging the first basket of earth with a golden pickaxe. It was the ultimate Neronian gesture, a great war against the geography of the earth itself. Thousands of Jewish prisoners sent by Vespasian were forced to dig in the heat. But like most of Nero's projects, it was eventually abandoned. He had the vision of a titan, but the attention span of a housefly. The mystery of the fall of empires is often found in this disconnect. The emperor was digging in the dirt of Greece while the foundations of his power in the West were turning to ash. In Rome, his freedman, Helius, was sending increasingly frantic letters begging the emperor to return. "The world is on fire," Helius essentially wrote. Nero replied that if Helius truly loved him, he would wish for his master to return only after he had fully mastered his craft. To Nero, the fall was less important than a perfectly executed vibrato. In 68 AD, Nero finally returned to Italy. He didn't enter Rome as a general returning from war. He entered as an Olympic victor. He had a section of the city wall torn down to make way for his procession, an ancient tradition for returning champions. He paraded his 1,808 wreaths, displaying them like the spoils of a conquered nation. But the crowds were quiet. The absurdity had reached its saturation point. Even the Roman mob, which loved a good show, was starting to realize that you can't eat a laurel wreath. The spark finally came from Gaul. Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor who had been watching the horizon, officially declared his rebellion. He didn't claim the throne for himself. He simply stated that Nero was a poor lyre player and unfit to rule. Of all the insults Nero had endured, being called a bad musician was the one that hurt the most. He reportedly spent more time discussing the technical specs of a new type of water organ than he did discussing the movement of Vindex's troops. Then came Galba, the governor of Hispania, a man as old and craggy as a mountain, joined the revolt. The mysterious momentum of collapse began to pick up speed. The Praetorian Guard, the men who had been the Viper's only shield, began to look at their options. Their prefect, Nymphidius Sabinus, realized that Nero was a sinking ship made of gold and ego, and he promised the guards a massive bribe to switch their allegiance to Galba.
Nero's final days were a masterpiece of pathetic absurdity. He woke up in the middle of the night to find that his guards had vanished. His friends had looted his golden cups and even his bedding. He wandered the palace looking for a gladiator to kill him, but everyone had suddenly found somewhere else to be. "Do I have neither a friend nor an enemy?" he asked, a final snarky realization that absolute power ends in absolute isolation. He fled to the villa of his freedman Phaon, 4 miles outside the city. He spent his last hours huddled in a basement, drinking lukewarm water from a puddle and trying to work up the courage to use a dagger. Even at the end, he was the artiste. His final recorded words were, "Qualis artifex pereo," "What an artist dies in me." When the horsemen arrived to arrest him, he finally drove the blade into his throat, aided by his secretary. He died with his eyes fixed in a terrifying, bulging stare, as if he were trying to catch a glimpse of the audience's reaction. With Nero, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the house of Augustus,
the line of Germanicus, came to a violent theatrical end. The great war of the family was over, but the fall was just beginning. The Roman world was left with a vacuum that could only be filled by more blood. The year of the 4 emperors was looming, and the gods were settling in for a much more violent play. Elsewhere, in the drafty ruins of the Golden House, the rotating ceiling stopped moving. The rose petals sat in heaps, turning brown, and the massive bronze statue of Nero remained in the vestibule, a giant hollow god watching a city that had already forgotten his name. The year 69 AD began with a silence that was far more terrifying than Nero's singing. It was the silence of a vacuum. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had treated the Roman Empire like a family heirloom for a century, had vanished into the basement of a freedman's villa. What remained was a sprawling, headless beast, an empire with the most powerful military on earth and absolutely no idea who was holding the leash. The absurdity of this year, often called the Year of the 4 Emperors, is that it played out like a high-stakes game of musical chairs where the chairs were made of swords. The first to sit was Galba. He was an old man, 72 years of age, with hands so crippled by gout that he couldn't hold a scroll, let alone a scepter. He arrived from Spain with a reputation for severity, but in Rome, severity without generosity is just a slow way to get assassinated. Galba's snarky reality was his cheapness. When the Praetorian Guard asked for the massive bribe they had been promised to betray Nero, Galba famously replied that he chose his soldiers, he did not buy them. It was a noble sentiment that lasted exactly as long as it took the soldiers to realize that loyalty doesn't pay for wine. The mystery of the fall of empires often begins with a ledger, when the men with the weapons realize the man with the money doesn't want to share. While Galba was busy counting pennies and executing Nero's old stagehands, the legions in the Rhine were having a crisis of their own. They didn't want a gouty old man in Rome. They wanted their own general, Vitellius. The intersection of war and myth was vividly displayed as the Rhine legions tore down Galba's images and replaced them with their own ambitions. In Rome, the plot thickened. Marcus Salvius Otho, a man who had once been Nero's best friend and whose wife, Poppaea, Nero had stolen, decided he had waited long enough for his turn. Otho was the artiste light. He wore a wig so realistic no one could tell he was bald, and he spent a fortune on face creams, but he knew how to talk to soldiers. He bribed the guard, and in January, Galba was hacked to death in the Forum. The old man's head was stuck on a pole and paraded like a grisly trophy of the new regime. Otho became the second emperor of the year. He had the throne, but he also had a problem. The Rhine legions were already marching toward Italy to put Vitellius in power. The Great War of 69 AD wasn't against barbarians. It was a Roman civil war, a mysterious and tragic display of the empire eating itself. The gods of Rome must have been exhausted. Jupiter, whose temple had survived the Great Fire, only to see the streets below run red with Roman blood, remained a silent witness to the carnage. The Battle of Bedriacum followed, a clash of iron against iron. Otho's forces were defeated, and in a rare moment of Roman dignity, Otho chose to commit suicide rather than continue the slaughter. He died with his composure that Nero would have envied, proving that even a man who wore face cream could find a spine when the script demanded it. Then came Vitellius, the third emperor. If Galba was the miser and Otho was the dandy, Vitellius was the glutton. His reign was a 4-month banquet. He reportedly spent 900 million sesterces on food alone, holding 4 massive feasts a day. The snarky reality of his rule was that the Roman Empire had become a catering service. While he was busy inventing new dishes, the legions in the east were looking at their commander, Vespasian, and realizing that a man who could handle the Judean rebels could probably handle a man who couldn't stop eating. The mystery of Vespasian was his lack of mystery. He was a plain man, a tax collector's son who smelled of the camp and the mule train. He didn't have a golden house or a wig. He had the legions of the East and the Danube. As Vitellius's soldiers and Vespasian's supporters clashed in the very streets of Rome, the great fire of Nero was echoed by a new disaster. The temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill was burned to the ground. The most sacred site in the Roman world was destroyed by Roman hands. It was the ultimate signal that the old world was truly dead.
Vitellius was dragged from his hiding place in a doorkeeper's lodge, pelted with dung, and tortured to death at the Gemonian stairs. His body was hooked and dragged into the Tiber, clearing the way for the 4th and final emperor of the year, Vespasian. The year of the 4 emperors ended with the Flavian dynasty. The madness had been replaced by management, but the scars on the city and the psyche of the people were deep. The empire had realized that the emperor was no longer a divine mystery. He was whoever the army said he was. Elsewhere, in the smoking ruins of the Capitoline, a few priests were already trying to find the foundation stones. They were looking for something solid in a world that had turned into a kaleidoscope of blood and ash. The year 70 AD was a year of reckoning. If the previous year had been a feverish delirium of shifting crowns and burning temples, this was the cold, gray dawn of the cleanup. Vespasian, the 4th emperor in a single calendar year, arrived in Rome not with a lyre or a golden pickaxe, but with a ledger. He was the son of a tax collector, and he viewed the Roman Empire not as a stage for his ego, but as a business that had been grossly mismanaged by its previous owners. The snarky reality of the Flavian era was its profound lack of glamour. Vespasian was a man who famously cracked jokes about the smell of money. When his son, Titus, complained about a new tax on the city's public urinals, Vespasian held a gold coin to the young man's nose and asked if it smelled of sewage. And yet, he noted dryly, it comes from urine. This was the new Roman spirit, pragmatism over poetry and profit over pretense. The absurdity of the Julio-Claudian excess was met with a deliberate architectural response.
Vespasian looked at Nero's golden house, that sprawling monument to a single man's vanity, and decided to give it back to the people. He drained the artificial lake at the center of the palace grounds, and in its place began the construction of the Flavian amphitheater. You know it as the Colosseum. The intersection of war and myth was never more brutal than in the games held within these walls. The Colosseum was built using the spoils of the Great War in Judea. In 70 AD, Titus had finally breached the walls of Jerusalem. The Second Temple, the mysterious and holy center of the Jewish world, was burned to the ground. The treasures of the temple, including the great menorah, were paraded through the streets of Rome in a triumph that served as the Flavian family's coming-out party. The gods of Rome were back in their temples, but the gods, it seems, were bored with Flavian stability. In the early years of his reign, Vespasian spent money rebuilding the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline, which had been burned during the chaos of Vitellius. He was trying to heal the mysterious fracture in the Roman soul, but he was doing it with iron and taxes. While the Colosseum rose stone by stone, the empire's borders were being tightened. The great wars of the Flavians were wars of consolidation. They pushed into Scotland, they stabilized the Rhine, and they crushed the remaining pockets of resistance in Judea. The fall of Masada in 73 AD was the final tragic exclamation point on the Jewish revolt. The defenders chose mass suicide over Roman slavery, a level of conviction that the cynical, pragmatic Vespasian likely found both impressive and deeply inconvenient. The mystery of the fall of empires is often postponed by leaders like Vespasian. He was a stabilizer. He reigned for 10 years, providing a decade of boring, predictable, and remarkably profitable government. He didn't talk to the moon, he talked to his accountants. The snarky tragedy of his death in 79 AD was as un-Neronian as possible. Feeling the end approaching, he insisted on being helped to his feet, saying an emperor should die standing. His last words were a final jab at the imperial cult. "Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god." He knew the game was a farce, but he played it until the last breath. He was succeeded by his son, Titus, the darling of mankind. But the gods, it seems, were bored with Flavian stability. In months of Titus taking the throne, the earth itself decided to remind Rome that empires are built on shifting ground. Elsewhere, on a quiet, sun-drenched coast in Campania, a mountain called Vesuvius was preparing to deliver a lecture on the fragility of human achievement. The people of Pompeii and Herculaneum were going about their daily lives, cleaning their shops, painting their walls, and perhaps complaining about the new Flavian taxes, unaware that they were about to be turned into a museum of ash. The madness was gone, but the tragedy was just beginning. The Flavian peace was about to be interrupted by a fire that no emperor could sing away.
While the absurdity of Caligula was a human creation, the tragedy of Pompeii was a divine one. People were frozen in time. A baker with his loaves, a dog on its leash, a family huddled in a cellar. They were transformed from living citizens of the empire into hollow molds of gray ash. Titus responded with a genuine, if somewhat overwhelmed, compassion. He diverted imperial funds to the survivors and personally visited the devastated region. It was a level of empathy that would have been unrecognizable to the previous dynasty.
But the Flavian curse, if such a thing existed, wasn't finished. Shortly after the eruption, a fire broke out in Rome that lasted 3 days and nights, followed by one of the worst plagues the city had ever seen. The intersection of war and myth had become a grim daily reality. The Great War was now against the elements and the invisible rot of disease. The mystery of Titus remains one of history's great what-ifs. He died in 81 AD after only 2 years in power at the age of 41. Some whispered that his younger brother, Domitian, had given him a helping hand into the afterlife, perhaps with a bowl of poisoned mushrooms, the traditional Julio-Claudian parting gift. Domitian became the last of the Flavians. If Vespasian was the accountant and Titus was the darling, Domitian was the recluse. He was a man who preferred the company of flies, whom he famously spent his afternoons catching with a stylus, to the company of the Senate. The snarky reality of his reign was a return to the madness, but without the flamboyant theater of Nero. Domitian's madness was quiet, bureaucratic, and deeply suspicious. He insisted on being addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Unlike Caligula, who demanded divinity because he was bored, Domitian demanded it because he was obsessed with order. He wanted to be the moral guardian of Rome, yet he lived in a state of constant, vibrating fear. He lined the walls of his palace with highly polished stone called fengite, which acted as a mirror so he could see anyone approaching him from behind as he walked. While Domitian was staring at the reflections in his walls, the empire was facing a new kind of threat on the Danube. King Decebalus of Dacia was proving that the barbarians were learning Roman tactics. The great wars of Domitian were expensive, messy, and ended in a series of humiliating treaties where Rome essentially paid the Dacians to stop being a nuisance. The gods of Rome were being treated with a rigid, almost fanatical devotion. Domitian revived the practice of burying Vestal virgins alive if they were found to have broken their vows, a mysterious and archaic punishment that satisfied his craving for traditionalist control. But the people didn't want a moral guardian who was terrified of his own shadow. They wanted a leader. As the 90s AD progressed, the Viper's Nursery moved from the cliffs of Capri to the polished hallways of the Palatine. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of conspiracy. Domitian's own wife began to fear for her life. The emperor had a list of people he intended to execute, and he kept it under his pillow. Elsewhere, in the drafty, silent provinces, the legions were beginning to realize that the Flavian line had run out of steam. The momentum of Vespasian had been spent on Domitian's mirrors and the Dacians' bribes. The stage was set for another fall, but this time it wouldn't be a year of chaos. It would be the beginning of something much more stable and much more artificial. The year 96 AD was a year of silent, frantic footsteps on marble. In the Palatine Palace, Domitian's obsession with his own reflection reached the level of a waking nightmare. He had become a prisoner of his own architecture. The snarky reality of a man who demands to be called Lord and God is that he eventually finds himself very lonely in a room of mirrors. Domitian's madness was not the loud musical variety of Nero, nor the erratic toddler tantrums of Caligula. It was a cold administrative paranoia. He was a man who understood that power is not just about the sword, but about the list. He kept a small tablets of death notebook under his pillow, filled with the names of those he intended to remove from the world. The absurdity of his final days was that he believed he could organize himself out of fate. The conspiracy that finally ended the Flavian dynasty was a mysterious and intimate affair. It wasn't led by a glorious general or a grand philosopher, but by the people who saw him every day, his servants, his freedmen, and crucially, his wife, Domitia. They managed to switch his tablets, and for the first time in years, Domitian found himself looking at a list he didn't control. The assassination was almost farcical in its execution. A man named Stephanos, pretending to have an injured arm, approached the emperor with a bandage concealing a dagger. While the Domitian was reading a fake report, Stephanos struck. The struggle was messy, a god king and a servant rolling on the floor of a mirrored room, the reflections multiplying the violence until the guards arrived to finish the job. The Senate's reaction was immediate and joyful. They didn't just kill Domitian, they enacted damnatio memoriae, the total erasure of his memory. They tore down his statues, scraped his name from the arches, and likely wished they could scrape the smell of his paranoia out of the air. It was a snarky end to the family of the tax collector. They were deleted from the very history they had tried to micromanage. In the vacuum that followed, the Senate did something they hadn't done in a century. They chose an emperor. They picked Nerva, a man so old, so frail, and so devoid of an army that he was essentially a human placeholder. Nerva's reign was a 15-month-long sigh of relief. But the mystery of the Roman Empire remained. The soldiers didn't care about the Senate's elderly favorites. They wanted a leader who smelled of the camp. To save his own life from a looming mutiny, Nerva adopted a man who was the polar opposite of the Palatine recluses. He adopted Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, or Trajan.
Trajan was a soldier's soldier. He was currently on the Rhine, and when he received the news of his adoption and Nerva's subsequent death, he didn't rush back to Rome to hold a theater performance or build a rotating dining room. He stayed on the border for a year, finishing his work and letting the Senate know that while they might have chosen him, he was the one who would be making the rules. The intersection of war and myth was about to enter its most expansive phase. If the Julio-Claudians were a tragedy and the Flavians were a business, the era of Trajan was an epic. He looked at the borders of the empire and decided they were too small. He looked at the great war with the Dacians that Domitian had bought his way out of, and he decided it was time to collect the debt. The gods of Rome were once again being carried into battle, but these weren't just the irritable neighbors of the past. They were the companions of the legion. Trajan was restoring the gravitas of the Roman name. The mystery of the fall was pushed so far into the future that it seemed like a myth. Under Trajan, the Roman Empire was about to reach its physical limit, stretching from the rain-soaked hills of Britain to the burning sands of Mesopotamia. Elsewhere, in the drafty northern forests, the Dacian king Decebalus was watching the Roman engineers build a bridge across the Danube, a real bridge of stone and iron, not a bridge of boats and ego. He realized that the time of bribes was over. The iron tide was coming, and this time it wouldn't be stopped by a joke. The 2nd century AD was beginning. It would be known as the era of the 5 good emperors, a period of such stability that the madness of the past seemed like a bad dream. But as any historian knows, the higher the tide rises, the more devastating the eventual ebb will be. The year 101 AD marked the beginning of what historians, in their rare moments of optimism, call the peak. If the 1st century was a chaotic family drama, the 2nd century was a masterclass in civil engineering and military expansion. Trajan was now firmly in control, and he brought with him a sense of purpose that felt almost alien to the halls of the Palatine. He was the first emperor born outside of Italy, a Spaniard with the sun in his veins and the dust of the frontier on his boots. The snarky reality of Trajan's reign was that he made being a good emperor look remarkably boring to anyone who enjoyed a scandal. There were no midnight mugs, no singing recitals, and no horses in the Senate. Instead, there was the great war against Dacia. Decebalus, the Dacian king, had spent years treating the Roman border like a revolving door, taking Domitian's gold and using it to sharpen his own spears. Trajan decided that the absurdity of paying for peace was over. The intersection of war and myth reached a fever pitch at the Danube River. To conquer Dacia, Trajan's architect, Apollodorus of Damascus, built a bridge that defied the logic of the age. It was a massive structure of wood and masonry that stretched over 3,000 feet across the churning waters. To the Dacians watching from the cliffs, it must have looked like the Romans were no longer just men, but titans who could command the very geography of the world. The mystery of the Dacian gold was the ultimate prize. Dacia sat on some of the richest gold and silver mines in Europe. Trajan's campaign was a systematic, grinding piece of work. He didn't want a treaty, he wanted the mountain. In 106 AD, the Roman legions finally breached the mountain fortress of Sarmes Aegiatusa. Decebalus, rather than being paraded through Rome in chains, cut his own throat beneath an oak tree as the Roman cavalry closed in. It was a scene so cinematic that Trajan had it carved onto a massive stone column in Rome, a 100-foot-tall comic strip of conquest that still stands today. The absurdity of the spoils was staggering. Trajan returned to Rome with an estimated 165,000 kilograms of gold and 330,000 kilograms of silver. This was the stimulus package of the millennium. He didn't use it to build a golden house for himself. He used it to build a massive new forum, a marketplace that looked like a temple to commerce, and a series of public works that made Rome feel like the true center of the universe. The gods of Rome were now being thanked on a scale never before seen. The Column of Trajan was not just a monument, it was a vertical narrative of Roman superiority. The mystery of the fall was forgotten. People believed the empire was eternal because it was profitable. The treasury was overflowing, the grain was cheap, and the games were spectacular. Trajan gave the people 123 days of festivities to celebrate his victory, during which 10,000 gladiators fought and 11,000 animals were killed. It was a great war turned into a public holiday. While Rome was celebrating, the emperor was looking east. He wanted to follow in the footsteps of Alexander the Great. He pushed the borders further than they had ever gone, capturing Mesopotamia and reaching the Persian Gulf. Legend has it that Trajan stood on the shore of the Gulf, watched a ship sailing to India, and wept because he was too old to follow it.
But the snarky truth about expansion is that the further you go, the more you have to leave behind. The mysterious strain on the empire's logistics was beginning to show. The borders were so long that the legions were stretched thin, a line of iron that was becoming dangerously brittle. In 117 AD, while returning from the east, Trajan died. He was a man who had conquered the world but couldn't conquer a stroke. His last act was the adoption of his cousin's son, Hadrian. Elsewhere, in the drafty northern outposts, the wind was picking up. Hadrian was a different kind of man. He looked at Trajan's vast conquests and realized that an empire that tries to own everything eventually ends up owning nothing but its own ruin. He was about to do something truly absurd in the eyes of the Roman military. He was going to stop.
The age of the wall was coming. The expansion was over, and the long, slow process of fortification, the psychological retreat, was about to begin. The year 117 AD brought a sudden, screeching halt to the Roman momentum. If Trajan was the empire's racing heart, Hadrian was its cooling brain. He inherited a world that was geographically bloated, economically exhausted, and panting for breath. The snarky reality of Hadrian's accession was that he immediately did the unthinkable. He gave back the keys. He abandoned the freshly conquered provinces of Mesopotamia, realizing that holding the desert was like trying to carry water in a sieve. The absurdity of Hadrian in the eyes of the Roman elite was that he didn't want to be a conqueror. He wanted to be an aesthete. He was a Graeculus, a little Greek who spent more time discussing the curve of a Corinthian column or the philosophy of the soul than the logistics of a siege. He was a man of the road, spending over half his 21-year reign traveling the provinces. He didn't just want to rule the empire, he wanted to see it, touch it, and fix its plumbing. The intersection of war and myth shifted from the battlefield to the boundary. Hadrian realized that an empire without a limit is just a target. In 122 AD, he arrived in the damp, miserable northern edge of Britannia. He looked at the mist-covered hills and the unruly Caledonian tribes who refused to acknowledge the divinity of Rome, and he ordered the construction of a wall. Hadrian's wall was 73 miles of stone and turf, a physical manifestation of a psychological shift. It was the moment the Roman Empire admitted that there were parts of the world it simply didn't want. The Great War was no longer about moving forward, it was about standing still. The wall wasn't just to keep the barbarians out, it was to keep the Roman soldiers in, to give them a sense of purpose in a world where there was nothing left to conquer. The mystery of the fall of empires often begins with this containment. When you stop growing, you start aging. But for Hadrian, this was the mysterious peak of Roman civilization. He rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome, a building so architecturally perfect that its dome remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. He was obsessed with the circle, the symbol of the eternal and the complete. The gods were no longer irritable neighbors, they were part of a grand geometric harmony. However, the absurdity of Hadrian's personal life was the talk of the empire. His devotion to a beautiful Greek youth named Antinous was so profound
that when the boy drowned in the Nile under mysterious circumstances, Hadrian didn't just mourn, he declared Antinous a god. He built a city in his name, Antinopolis, and filled the empire with thousands of statues of the boy. It was the ultimate snarky flex of power. He forced the entire Roman world to worship his grief. While Hadrian was busy turning his heartbreak into a religion, a different kind of fire was smoldering in Judea. The Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 AD was perhaps the most desperate and violent of all the Jewish wars. Hadrian, the lover of peace and architecture, responded with a cold, systematic brutality that rivaled the worst of the Caesars. He banned the Torah, renamed the province Syria Palestina, and rebuilt Jerusalem as a Roman colony called Aelia Capitolina. The Great War was won, but at the cost of erasing a culture's heart. The mystery of the 5 good emperors is that their goodness was a matter of perspective. Under Hadrian, the empire was stable, wealthy, and beautiful, but it was also becoming a museum. The art was an imitation of the past. The literature was a commentary on older works. The creative fire that had built the Republic was being replaced by the polished marble of the bureaucracy. In 138 AD, Hadrian died in his villa at Tivoli, a sprawling estate that was essentially a scale model of the entire world. He left the empire to Antoninus Pius, a man so steady and unremarkable that he barely appears in the history books. It was a reign of mysterious silence, 23 years of peace where nothing happened. And in the world of Roman history, nothing happening is the greatest luxury an empire can buy. Elsewhere, in the drafty, silent gaps of the border walls, the pressure was mounting. The great wars of the future were already brewing in the migrations of tribes far beyond the Roman gaze. The stone was silent for now, but the wind was beginning to whistle through the cracks. The age of the philosopher king was coming, and with him, the realization that even the best managed empire cannot negotiate with a plague. The year 161 AD arrived with a certain somber dignity. If Hadrian was the empire's architect and Antoninus Pius was its quiet caretaker, Marcus Aurelius was its weary conscience. He was the philosopher king, a man who spent his nights writing meditations on the insignificance of human glory, while his days were consumed by the grinding machinery of an empire that refused to stay put. The snarky reality of Marcus Aurelius's reign was the cosmic irony of his situation. Here was a man who craved the silence of a library and the simplicity of a stoic's porch, yet he was forced to spend almost his entire reign in the mud and cold of the frontier. The absurdity of power had reached its most philosophical stage. The man who believed that all is opinion was tasked with commanding the most opinionated army in the world. The mystery of the 5 good emperors was about to meet its first true existential threat. The peace of Antoninus Pius had been a beautiful illusion, a bubble of stability that burst the moment Marcus took the throne. In the East, the Parthian Empire, that perennial thorn in Rome's side, decided to test the new emperor by seizing Armenia. The Great War was back, but this time it brought something back with it that was far more dangerous than Parthian arrows.
When the Roman legions returned from the east in 165 AD, they brought with them a mysterious and invisible enemy, the Antonine Plague. Modern historians suspect it was smallpox. It swept through the empire like a silent scythe, claiming an estimated 5 to 10 million lives. The snarky tragedy was absolute. The Roman roads, built to move soldiers and commerce, were now perfectly designed to move death. In some cities, the streets were so quiet you could hear the gods breathing, or perhaps just the wind whistling through empty houses. The intersection of war and myth took a desperate turn. Marcus Aurelius, in an attempt to appease the gods, filled Rome with every priest, magician, and mystic he could find. He performed every ritual in the book, yet the plague continued to feast. The absurdity was that even a man of profound reason had to resort to superstition when the world became unreasonable. While the empire was coughing its lungs out, the northern borders collapsed. The Marcomanni and Quadi tribes crossed the Danube, piercing as far as northern Italy, the first time barbarians had touched Italian soil in centuries. The Great War of Marcus's life was fought in the dark, damp forests of the north. For years he lived in camp, writing his meditations by the light of a flickering lamp, while the sounds of Germanic war cries echoed in the distance. The mystery of the fall of empires is often found in the exhaustion of its best men. Marcus was a man who believed that life is war and a journey in a foreign land. He didn't fight for glory. He fought because he felt it was his duty to maintain the cosmopolis. But the costs were mounting. To fund the wars, he had to auction off the imperial jewelry and furniture. The first citizen was having a yard sale to pay for the iron. The gods, in the Stoic mind, were part of a rational logos, but the reality on the ground was anything but rational. The plague had decimated the tax base and the army. The mysterious momentum that had sustained Rome since the time of Augustus was flagging. In 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius died in the camp at Vindobona, modern-day Vienna. He was 58, exhausted by duty, grief, and a world that simply wouldn't be fixed. His death marked the end of the Golden Age. The succession, however, was his greatest failure. He abandoned the system of adopting a worthy heir and left the empire to his biological son, Commodus. The snarky reality of Commodus was that he was the anti-Marcus. He didn't want to be a philosopher. He wanted to be Hercules. He didn't want to write books. He wanted to kill animals in the arena. The viper's nursery was about to reopen, and the madness that had been suppressed for a century was about to return with a club and a lion skin. Elsewhere, in the drafty, abandoned studies of the dead philosophers, the ink was drying on the final pages of Roman stability. The fall was no longer a distant rumor. It was the man walking into the arena, wearing a leopard skin cape and demanding to be called a god. The year 180 AD felt like the closing of a heavy leather-bound book and the opening of a cheap, garish pamphlet. If Marcus Aurelius was the somber twilight of Roman reason, his son Commodus was the neon-lit, blood-soaked fever dream that followed. The absurdity of the succession was a joke that the Stoics forgot to prepare for. The empire had gone from being ruled by a man who hated power to a boy who treated it like an infinite supply of poisoned candy. Commodus was 19, handsome,
and possessed the intellectual depth of a puddle in a rainstorm. His first snarky act of state was to abandon the Marcomannic Wars. He didn't care about the Danubian frontier or the Logos. He wanted to go back to Rome because the wine was better and the girls didn't wear furs. He signed a hasty peace treaty with the barbarians, effectively wasting years of his father's toil, and raced back to the city to throw a party that would last for 12 years. The mystery of the madness of Commodus was its lack of creativity compared to Caligula. While Caligula wanted to be a god of the sky, Commodus wanted to be a god of the dirt. He became obsessed with the image of Hercules. He didn't just want to be worshipped, he wanted to be seen sweating. He spent his days in the arena, dressed in a lion's skin and carrying a massive club, fighting as a gladiator. The intersection of war and myth reached a peak of profound embarrassment. Commodus would enter the arena to fight disabled people, animals, and terrified professional gladiators who knew to win was to be executed. He reportedly killed 100 lions in a single day, shooting them from a safe platform with arrows tipped with crescent-shaped heads to decapitate them. He charged the city of Rome 1,000,000 sesterces for every appearance. It was the ultimate great war of the ego, an emperor fighting a one-sided battle against a captive audience. While the gladiator king was busy collecting his appearance fees, the empire was quietly rotting. The Antonine Plague had left the economy in a state of brittle exhaustion, and Commodus's solution was to ignore it. He left the administration to a series of favorites, men like Perennis and Cleander, who turned the government into a literal auction house. You could buy a consulship, a province, or a legal verdict if you had enough gold. The mysterious fall of empires is often accelerated when the people realize that the law is just a luxury product for the wealthy. The gods were increasingly confused. Commodus renamed the months of the year after his own various titles. He renamed the city of Rome Colonia Commodana. He even renamed the legions. He was attempting to rewrite the Roman world in his own image, turning a 1,000-year-old civilization into a personal fan club.
The snarky reality of his end was as messy as a day in the arena. By 192 AD, the inner circle, including his mistress Marcia and his chamberlain, realized that their names were on the emperor's to-do list of executions. They tried to poison his beef, but Commodus, being a fit athlete, simply vomited it up. In a moment of pure absurdity, they had to send in his wrestling partner, a man named Narcissus, to strangle him in his bath. The Hercules of Rome was taken down by a simple chokehold. With the death of Commodus, the era of the good emperors was truly irrevocably dead. The vacuum he left behind wasn't just political, it was moral. The Roman people had watched their emperor play the fool in the sand for a decade, and they had lost the ability to take the office seriously. The year 193 AD was looming, the year of the 5 emperors. It was the 4 emperors of 69 AD, but with more blood and a higher price tag. The Praetorian Guard was about to do something so mysterious and shameful that it would become a symbol for the decline of the West. They weren't just going to choose an emperor, they were going to put the world on eBay. Elsewhere, in the drafty, cold barracks of the provinces, the generals were looking at their swords. They had watched the circus in Rome, and they had decided that if the throne was for sale, they might as well pay for it with iron. The year 193 AD opened with a scene of such staggering absurdity that even the ghost of Caligula might have blushed at the lack of subtlety. Following the strangling of Commodus, a respectable old soldier named Pertinax was placed on the throne. He lasted 87 days. He tried to fix the budget and discipline the Praetorian Guard, a fatal mistake in an era where the guards had grown accustomed to being paid for their silence and their smiles. They cut him down in the palace, but instead of fleeing in shame, they did something mysterious. They went to the walls of their camp and announced that the Roman Empire was for sale to the highest bidder. The snarky reality of the auction of the empire is a low point in human political history. Two men stood at the gates, shouting out prices. Didius Julianus eventually won by promising every soldier 25,000 sesterces. He was escorted to the palace by a guard that looked less like a military unit and more like a collection of debt collectors. Julianus sat on the throne, but he was an emperor of paper. He had bought the world, but he forgot that the world is mostly made of soldiers who weren't in that specific room. The news of the auction reached the frontiers, and the reaction was a collective sharpening of blades. 3 different generals, Pescennius Niger in the east, Claudius Albinus in Gaul, and Septimius Severus on the Danube, decided that if the empire was for sale, they'd rather pay in blood than gold. Severus, a man from Leptis Magna in North Africa, was the fastest. He marched on Rome with the rhythmic, terrifying speed of a desert predator. Septimius Severus was the first African emperor, a man whose Latin had a thick Punic accent and whose heart was made of cold, calculated iron. When he arrived in Rome, Julianus was executed in his palace, weeping and asking what he had done wrong. The answer, of course, was that he had bought a chair he couldn't defend. Severus didn't bother with the absurdity of the Senate's approval. He marched his Danubian legions into the city, disbanded the old Praetorian Guard, and replaced them with his own loyalists. The Great War of the Severan era was a civil war that spanned the globe. Severus spent the next 4 years hunting down his rivals. He defeated Niger in the east and then turned on Albinus in Gaul. The Battle of Lugdunum in 197 AD involved 150,000 men, the largest clash of Roman against Roman in history. The intersection of war and myth had become a grim reality. The fall was being held at bay only by the sheer, brutal competence of a man who told his sons, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men." The snarky tragedy of the Severan dynasty was that it turned the empire into a military dictatorship. The first citizen was dead. The warlord had arrived. Severus spent his reign on the move, rebuilding the east, and finally traveling to Britain to try and finish what Hadrian had walled off. The mystery of the fall of empires is often found in the quality of the heirs. Severus had 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta, who hated each other with a mysterious and prehistoric intensity. As Severus lay dying in York in 211 AD, his last advice was about harmony. It was advice that his elder son, Caracalla, ignored before his father's body was even cold. Caracalla was the viper of the 3rd century. He lacked his father's intelligence, but possessed all of his cruelty. In 212 AD, he invited his brother Geta to a reconciliation meeting in their mother's apartments, where he had Geta murdered in her arms. Then he went on a rampage of damnatio memoria, erasing his face from every painting and his name from every monument. The absurdity was total.
You could be executed for simply mentioning the name of the emperor's brother. While Caracalla was busy being a fratricide, he issued the Constitutione Antoniniana, granting Roman citizenship to every free inhabitant of the empire. It sounds noble, but the snarky truth was that it was a tax grab. Only citizens paid inheritance taxes, and Caracalla needed money to pay the soldiers, the only people he truly feared. The gods of Rome were now being joined by the gods of the desert and the sun. The mysterious shift toward Eastern cults was accelerating. Caracalla himself was obsessed with Alexander the Great, often dressing in Macedonian clothes and dreaming of a world conquest that his own paranoia prevented him from ever achieving. In 217 AD, while he was stopping to urinate on the side of a road in Mesopotamia, Caracalla was stabbed to death by one of his own guards. It was a pathetic, unceremonious end for a man who thought himself a titan.
Elsewhere in the drafty, silent gaps of the bureaucracy, the finances were collapsing. The silver content of the denarius had dropped to almost nothing. The fall was no longer a ghost, it was the currency in your pocket. The age of the barracks emperors was coming, and with it a chaos that would make the year of the 4 emperors look like a quiet afternoon at the library. The year 218 AD witnessed a turn in Roman history that moved beyond mere absurdity and into the realm of the truly psychedelic. With the death of Caracalla and the brief, stuttering reign of the lawyer Macrinus, the women of the Severan dynasty, led by the formidable Julia Maesa, decided they weren't quite finished with the world. They produced a 14-year-old boy named Elagabalus, claiming he was the secret love child of Caracalla, and used a massive bribe to convince the Syrian legions that the Viper's bloodline was back. The snarky reality of Elagabalus was that he didn't care about Rome, the Senate, or the ironclad traditions of the West. He was the high priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal, and he arrived in Rome not as a general, but as a walking spectacle of silk, makeup, and mysterious Eastern rituals. He brought with him a massive black meteorite, the physical embodiment of his god, and paraded it through the streets on a chariot led by 6 white horses, which he drove backward so he could always face the stone. The absurdity of his 4-year reign was a cultural shock that the Roman elite never recovered from. Elagabalus attempted to replace Jupiter, the king of the gods, with his black rock. He married a Vestal virgin, claiming that a god and a priestess would produce divine children, a move that in the old days would have seen him buried alive. He was reportedly more interested in the color of his eyeliner and the quality of his rose petal baths than the fact that the Roman borders were being poked and prodded by every barbarian tribe with a sharpened stick. The mystery of the fall of empires is often found in this clash of values. Rome was a city of stone, gravity, and ancient law. Elagabalus was a whirlwind of silk, perfume, and sacred prostitution. He held snarky lotteries at his banquets where you could win a box of flies or 10 camels. He reportedly asked his doctors if there was a way to give him female anatomy. To the Roman soldiers, who still valued the man of iron image of Septimius Severus, this was no longer an empire, it was a theater of the grotesque. The intersection of war and myth had become entirely religious. The Great War was being fought over which god sat at the head of the table. But the soldiers' patience had a very specific price tag, and when Elagabalus tried to kill his more popular cousin, Alexander Severus, the Praetorian Guard decided they had seen enough.
In 222 AD, they murdered the boy emperor and his mother in the latrines, dragged their bodies through the streets, and tossed them into the Tiber. Alexander Severus took the throne at 13. He was the last of the Severins, a boy who tried desperately to be good. He listened to his mother, Julia Mamaea, who essentially ran the empire as a CEO, and he tried to restore the dignity of the Senate. But the mysterious rot of the 3rd century was now structural. The currency was a joke. The denarius was now essentially a copper coin with a thin wash of silver that wore off if you looked at it too hard. The Great War of the East returned, but with a new and much more terrifying face. The Parthians had been replaced by the Sassanid Persians, a revived empire that claimed the glory of the ancient Achaemenids. They didn't want to just trade, they wanted their land back. Alexander Severus marched east to face them, but the campaign was a messy, expensive stalemate. The snarky tragedy of Alexander's end came in 325 AD on the Rhine. He tried to buy peace from the Germanic tribes rather than fight them. The soldiers, who had spent years being told they were the masters of the world, felt insulted. They didn't want a negotiator who listened to his mother. They wanted a giant who led from the front. They found their man in Maximinus Thrax, a soldier who was reportedly 8 feet tall and could crumble stones with his bare hands. They murdered Alexander in his tent, ending the Severan dynasty and opening the gates to the crisis of the 3rd century. The fall was no longer a slow erosion, it was a landslide. For the next 50 years, the Roman Empire would have over 26 emperors, most of whom would die by the sword of their own men. The gods were silent, the borders were open, and the world was about to find out exactly how much chaos it could endure. The year 235 AD did not just mark a change in leadership, it marked a mutation of the Roman soul. The absurdity of the past had moved from the drawing room to the barracks. Maximinus Thrax, the man who succeeded the scholarly Alexander Severus, was the personification of the barracks emperor. He was a Thracian peasant who had risen through the ranks purely for his ability to hit things harder than anyone else. He was the first emperor who never set foot in Rome during his reign. He considered the city a nest of soft, perfumed weaklings, and the Senate a collection of walking corpses. The snarky reality of Maximinus was his sheer physical scale. Legend says he was so large he wore his wife's bracelet as a thumb ring and could pull a fully laden wagon by himself. He viewed the empire as a giant supply depot for his wars on the Rhine and Danube. To pay for his soldiers, he didn't just tax the wealthy, he stripped the temples of their gold and melted down public statues. The intersection of war and myth had become purely transactional. The gods were only useful if they were made of bullion.
The mystery of the year of the 6 emperors in 238 AD was the final scream of the Roman establishment against this brute force. The Senate, in a rare moment of suicidal bravery, declared Maximinus a public enemy and backed a wealthy 80-year-old aristocrat in North Africa named Gordian I. Gordian and his son, Gordian II, lasted only 22 days before the governor of Numidia, loyal to Maximinus, crushed them. But the absurdity wouldn't stop. The Senate then elected 2 of their own, Pupienus and Balbinus, who hated each other so much they spent their meetings arguing while Maximinus was literally marching on Italy. Maximinus, however, met his end not in battle, but at the walls of Aquileia. His own soldiers, starving and tired of the endless sieges, murdered the giant in his tent. They cut off his head and sent it to Rome, where the people cheered for a victory they hadn't actually fought. The snarky tragedy of 238 AD ended with the elevation of a 13-year-old, Gordian III. He was a puppet for the Praetorian Guard and his father-in-law, Timesitheus. For a few years, there was a mysterious lull in the chaos, a brief moment where the empire tried to pretend it wasn't bleeding to death. But the Sassanid Persians were growing stronger in the east, and in 244 AD, Gordian III died during a campaign in Mesopotamia. Some say he died in battle. Others say his successor, Philip the Arab, had him quietly suffocated. Philip the Arab was a man of the desert who found himself presiding over the most mysterious anniversary in history, the 1000th birthday of Rome in 428 AD. While the borders were collapsing and the currency was essentially worthless, Philip threw the Ludi Seculares, the secular games. It was the ultimate snarky paradox. Rome was celebrating its eternal nature while its foundations were turning to dust. They killed thousands of exotic animals in the Colosseum, including hippos and rhinos, to prove that Rome was still the master of the world. But the gods were not impressed by the party. The Great War of the 3rd century was now a permanent state of being. Philip was soon overthrown by Decius, a man who believed that the fall was happening because the Romans had abandoned their old gods for new, mysterious Eastern cults, specifically the Christians. Decius launched the first empire-wide persecution, demanding that everyone sacrifice to the state gods. The snarky irony? Decius, the man who wanted to restore Roman piety, became the first emperor to be killed by barbarians in battle. At the Battle of Abritus in 251 AD, he and his son were driven into a swamp by the Goths and never seen again. The Viper's nursery was now the entire frontier, and the Vipers were hungry. Elsewhere, in the drafty, smoke-filled tents of the Gothic chieftains, the myth of Roman invincibility had been shattered. They had killed an emperor. They had tasted the gold of the provinces. The fall was no longer a mystery to them. It was an opportunity. The world was about to enter the darkest hour of the 3rd century, the reign of Gallienus, where the empire would literally split into 3 pieces and the emperor of Rome would be reduced to a man holding a shard of a broken mirror. The year 260 AD arrived like a cold wind blowing through a house with no doors. If the previous decades were a series of unfortunate events, this was the moment the Roman Empire simply pulled apart at the seams. The absurdity of the situation was personified by the Emperor Valerian. He had marched east to face the Sassanid king Shapur I, only to be captured during a parley. The snarky reality of Valerian's fate is one of the most humiliating, mysterious footnotes in history. Legend has it that Shapur used the Roman emperor as a human footstool to mount his horse. When Valerian eventually died in captivity, the Persians reportedly flayed him, stuffed his skin with straw, and dyed it red to display in a temple. It was the ultimate intersection of war and myth. The living god of Rome had been turned into a piece of taxidermy. While Valerian was serving as a Persian Ottoman, Gallienus was left to pick up the pieces of a world that no longer wanted to be together. The mysterious collapse was now geographic. In the West, a general named Postumus decided he was tired of sending taxes to a Rome that couldn't protect him. He declared the Gallic Empire, taking Gaul, Spain, and Britain with him. In the east, the merchant prince of Palmyra, Odaenathus, and later his famous widow Zenobia, carved out their own kingdom, protecting the frontier but keeping the profits. The Roman Empire was now a shattered mirror. The central authority in Rome controlled only Italy, North Africa, and the Balkans. Gallienus, a man of surprising resilience and snarky intellectualism, realized he couldn't fight everyone at once. He spent his reign rushing from one border to another like a man trying to stop a flood with his thumbs. He was a patron of the Neoplatonist philosopher Plotinus, trying to find mysterious cosmic meaning while his generals were busy betraying him. The mystery of the fall of empires often features a moment of innovation born of desperation. Gallienus created a highly mobile cavalry force, the comitantes, the ancestors of the medieval knight. He realized that the old, slow-moving legions were useless against the swift Gothic raiders, but his soldiers didn't reward his ingenuity. They murdered him in 1668 AD during a siege in Milan. Then came the Illyrian emperors, tough, no-nonsense men from the Balkans who didn't care about philosophy, silk, or the Senate's feelings. They were the iron that the empire needed to weld the mirror back together. The first was Claudius Gothicus, who earned his name by slaughtering thousands of Goths at the Battle of Nisus. He might have saved the world, but he died of the plague, a mysterious reminder that nature is the only general that always wins.
His successor was Aurelian, a man known to his troops as Hand on Hilt. If the 3rd century was a great war of chaos, Aurelian was the restorer of the world. In just 5 years, he achieved the impossible. He marched east and defeated Queen Zenobia, bringing the Palmyrene Empire back into the fold. He then marched west and forced the Gallic Empire to surrender. Aurelian was the first emperor to build a massive, thick wall around Rome itself, the Aurelian Walls. It was a snarky admission that the heart of the empire was no longer safe. He also promoted the worship of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, trying to give the empire a single, unifying god. But like so many before him, his mysterious end came at the hands of a disgruntled secretary who forged a death list, causing the emperor's own officers to kill him in 275 AD out of fear. The empire was restored, but it was a shell of its former self. The walls were walled, the currency was debased, and the people were exhausted. The fall had been postponed, but the price was a world that felt more like a fortress than a civilization. Elsewhere, in the drafty, cold highlands of Illyria, a young soldier named Diocles was watching. He saw that the empire was too big for one man, too broken for old solutions, and too sacred to be left to chance. He was about to introduce the most absurd and rigid system Rome had ever seen, the rule of 4. By the year 284 AD, the Roman Empire was no longer a state. It was a patient that had been repeatedly clinically dead and then shocked back to life by the sheer brutality of its soldiers. Into this wreckage stepped Diocletian. If Augustus was the architect of the empire's soul, Diocletian was the architect of its cage. He looked at the mysterious chaos of the last 50 years and concluded that the problem was simple. The empire was too heavy for one man to lift without his spine snapping. The snarky reality of Diocletian's solution was the tetrarchy,
the rule of four. He divided the world into East and West, with 2 senior emperors, Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, Caesars. It was a beautiful, geometric dream of power sharing that ignored the most basic absurdity of human nature. People with swords generally do not like to share. Diocletian moved the capital away from Rome, leaving the eternal city to rot in its own history. He sat in Nicomedia, dressed in robes stiff with gold and pearls, demanding that anyone who approached him prostrate themselves on the floor. The first citizen had finally, officially become a lord. He fixed prices with a massive, bureaucratic edict that failed almost immediately because you cannot legislate the cost of a cabbage when the currency is made of wishful thinking. The intersection of war and myth under Diocletian took its most violent turn against the Christians. This was the Great Persecution, a final, desperate attempt to force the world back into a traditionalist mold. Diocletian believed that the fall was being caused by the neglect of the old gods. He burned books, destroyed churches, and executed thousands. But the mysterious resilience of the faith was stronger than the emperor's iron. In 305 AD, Diocletian did the most absurd thing in Roman history. He retired. He went to his palace in Split to grow cabbages, leaving the rule of four to function on its own. It lasted about as long as it takes for a candle to flicker in a gale. The sons of the tetrarchs immediately fell upon each other. Out of this bloodbath emerged Constantine. In 312 AD, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, the intersection of war and myth reached its ultimate climax. Constantine claimed to see a cross in the sky and the words, "In this sign, conquer." He won the battle, took Rome, and realized that if you can't beat the mysterious new religion, you should probably make it your own. The snarky irony of Constantine was that he saved the empire by transforming it into something unrecognizable. He moved the capital to Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople, and legalized Christianity. He was a man of the sun who became the patron of the sun. The great war for the soul of the empire was over, and the cross had replaced the eagle. But the walls were still there, the borders were still leaking, and the fall was no longer a mystery. It was the slow, rhythmic sound of a world going to sleep. The year 476 AD arrived not with a roar, but with a tired, dry cough. The Roman Empire in the West had become a mysterious shadow of itself. It was a world of walled villas, bankrupt cities, and emperors who were mostly children, were puppets of barbarian generals. The absurdity of the end was personified by the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus. He bore the names of the founder of the city and the founder of the empire, yet he was a boy of 14 who spent his days playing with toy soldiers while the real ones surrounded his palace. The snarky reality of the fall is that most people living through it didn't realize it was happening. They just thought the taxes were too high, the roads were bumpier, and the neighbors were speaking more Germanic dialects. The Great War had become a series of local skirmishes over bags of grain and rusty armor. The gods of Rome were gone, replaced by the spires of a church that was already preparing to outlast the state. Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain, finally walked into the palace in Ravenna and told the boy emperor to go home. He didn't even bother to kill him, he just gave him a pension and told him to go live in the country. He sent the imperial regalia, the purple cloak and the crown, to Constantinople, effectively saying that the West was closed for business. The mystery of the fall of empires is that they don't really fall, they just dissolve into the earth, like the marble of the Palatine turning back into dust. The madness of Caligula, the stoicism of Marcus Aurelius, and the vanity of Nero were now just stories told in the flicker of a tallow candle in a drafty monastery. The light was dimming, and the long, deep sleep of the Middle Ages was beginning to settle over the hills of Europe.
And so, we reach the end of our journey through the wreckage. The marble is cold, the torches have burned down to embers, the little boots have long since turned to dust, and the silence of the forum is absolute. Thank you for staying with me through these long, dusty centuries. If you found peace in these tales of ancient absurdity, I'm glad. Sleep well, or perhaps simply enjoy the quiet that follows the collapse of a world. If you've enjoyed this marathon of history, remember to subscribe and join me again when we next explore the shadows of the past. But for now, the story is finished. The empire is still. Good night.